You have probably seen his most famous sentence sold to you as encouragement, printed over a photograph of a mountain at first light, hung on the wall of a gym, quoted by someone explaining how hard they push themselves. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Albert Camus, wrote those words, and he did not mean them the way the posters mean them. Sisyphus, Sisyphus, was a figure the old Greeks used to frighten themselves with. For the crime of outwitting the gods, he was sentenced to roll an enormous boulder up a hill, and each time he neared the top, the stone tore loose and rolled back down, and he walked after it and started over, and this was to be his labour for the whole of eternity, all of it for nothing. When Camus told you to imagine that man happy, he was not talking about grinding through a hard week at the office. He was talking about someone doing something perfectly pointless forever in a universe that would never once tell him why, and he was asking, without a flicker of irony, whether that man might still be happy, not in spite of how meaningless it was, but because he had somehow stopped needing it to mean anything at all. That is the man underneath the poster. He was not a motivational coach, and he was not the collar-up, cigarette-in-hand face that gets reprinted on tote bags and paperback covers. He was someone who had looked, as steadily as anyone ever has, at the possibility that life has no built-in point, and had found there no author, no plan, and nothing waiting at the end to make the sums come out even. Most people who reach that thought do one of two things: they look away from it, or they fall in. Camus did neither. He grew up in 2 rented rooms in a poor district of Algiers, with no books in the house, and a mother who was nearly deaf and could barely read, and he went on to become one of the most celebrated writers alive and to win the Nobel Prize at 44. And beneath everything he wrote sat a single, stubborn question. If the universe is silent, if no meaning is handed down to you from above, is that a reason for despair, or is it, strangely, the place where freedom begins? He had come to that question the hard way. At 17, he had already coughed blood into a handkerchief and understood that his own body was carrying a deadline he could not argue with. So when he pressed the point, he was not playing a game. If none of it finally comes to anything, why not simply stop? And if you choose to go on anyway, what is it exactly that you are going on for? Can a person be happy with no hope of things ever resolving? And if they can, is that even the same word we usually mean by happiness? These were not riddles to him. They were the only questions he could see that were fully honest, and he would refuse again and again every answer that asked him to look away from them. He decided the silence was freedom, and he spent the rest of his life saying so. People have argued ever since about whether he truly earned that answer, or whether it was the most beautiful evasion of the century, the work of a man so in love with the sun that he could not bear to finish the darker thought. Tonight, we're going to sit with all of it, everything this strange, bright, contradictory mind actually worked out, and the one place, near the very end, where it may have come apart. There is a small and terrible detail waiting for us there. When he died, suddenly and senselessly, at 46, there was an unused train ticket in his coat pocket. He had meant to take the train. None of this is anything you have to settle tonight. It is late, and the kind of question that feels heavy at noon, what any of it is finally for, rests more lightly here in the dark, where there is nothing to decide and nowhere you need to be. So let yourself sink down a little. Your shoulders are probably higher than they need to be. Let them come down. We have a few slow hours in front of us, and nothing about them needs to be rushed. If a calm and honest piece like this is the kind of thing you would like more of, subscribing is a small gesture that helps it keep being made. And here is one question to carry down with you, with no obligation to answer it. Is there something in your own life you have been calling meaningless, when the truer word might simply be quiet? Hold it loosely. And now we go back to where he began. A bright, poor apartment above a busy street in Algiers, a home full of silence, and a boy who never once heard the sound of his father's voice. What the boy had of his father amounted to almost nothing. A name, Lucian, a photograph of a stranger standing straight in the stiff collar of a uniform, a splinter of shell metal kept in a small tin that they said had been drawn from the wound, and one story which his mother handed him over the years in pieces because she did not hand over much in words. The story went like this. Before the war, before the boy was even born, a man near the farm where his father worked the vines had murdered a whole family of settlers, the children along with the parents, for money, the kind of crime that makes a district hungry to see the killer dead. His father was hungry for it too. He was a hard-working, plain-spoken man who believed that certain acts put a person outside the circle of other human beings, and on the morning they were to guillotine the murderer. He rose long before dawn and walked into town to watch justice be done. He came back a changed man. He said nothing about what he had seen, lay down on the bed, turned his face to the wall, and then, without a word, began to be sick, and went on being sick until there was nothing left in him. He never spoke of it again. That is nearly all the son would ever know of his father. Not the warmth of being held, not the sound of a voice, but a second-hand account of a strong man undone by the sight of a killing carried out in the name of the law. He would carry it to the end of his life, and one day he would build out of it a public case against the death penalty, and beneath the case something harder to name, an early and permanent suspicion that the people most certain they stand on the side of justice are often the ones about to do the ugliest thing. All of that lay decades ahead. For now there was only the tin, the photograph, and a father who died in the autumn of 1914, a few weeks into the war, hit in the head by shrapnel at the First Battle of the Marne, and carried to a hospital in France where he never properly woke. Albert was not yet a year old. The first fact of his life, lying beneath all the others, was an absence in the shape of a man. There was no money afterward, and nowhere in particular to go, so his mother gathered her two small boys and went back into the city, to Algiers, to two rented rooms in a poor, roaring district called Belcourt, where her own mother already lived. It is worth seeing the place because he never stopped seeing it. Outside, a street loud with trams and hawkers and heat coming up off the pavement. Inside, two rooms without a single book in them, no water of their own, one lamp, a tap, and a toilet shared out on the landing, and through all of it, a silence you could almost lean your weight against. The silence began with his mother. Catherine spent her days on her knees, cleaning the houses of people with more than she had, and she was nearly deaf, and she spoke very little, a few hundred words perhaps, to cover the whole of her life. An illness in her girlhood had taken most of her hearing and left her speech slow and bare, and what the illness spared, her widowhood seems to have finished. She was not cold. The boy knew, the way children know things no one tells them, that she loved him. But the love lived underneath language, down in the same quiet as everything else, and it could not be spoken, and it could not quite be reached. One image came back to him for the rest of his life, whenever he sat down and tried to put her into words. It is evening. The day's work is behind her, and his mother sits at the window in the last grey of the light, not reading, because she cannot, not talking, because there is no one who needs telling and few words to tell it with, only sitting, looking down at the street with her worn hands still in her lap. Be the boy for a moment. You are small, a few feet from the person you love most on the earth, and there is nothing to say and no way to say it, even if the words were there. You may know that ache yourself. To love someone completely across a distance no sentence will cross. A grandparent who has drifted somewhere far inside. A parent who could never once say it. A person whose language is not your language. You sit together in the lamplight. The love is real. and still, in some way you cannot fix, each of you is alone with it. She was not the only silence in those rooms. An uncle lived there too, a barrel maker, broad-shouldered and kind, who was himself deaf and could not speak, and who in later years would take the boy into the hills to hunt on Sunday mornings, the two of them walking for miles without a word passing between them. Two people sealed away from sound under one roof, and a child learning, long before he had any argument for it, that you can be surrounded by people you love and still spend a great share of your life in silence, none of which made the house peaceful. Over all of it presided his grandmother, harsh where his mother was soft, the loud fact of that childhood. She was a proud, hard, theatrical old woman who had buried most of her hopes along with several of her children, and she governed the household with a whip of dried bull's hide kept for the purpose, bringing it down on the boys for the ordinary crimes of boyhood, while their mother sat by and did not intervene, too gentle or too tired, or too far inside her own quiet to rise. So he took in early two lessons that would sit uneasily together in him ever after, that the people who love you may be unable to shield you or even to speak to you, and that you had therefore better go out and find, somewhere past those two rooms, your own reasons to be glad you were alive. It is tempting to run a straight line from that apartment to the philosophy he would spend his life building, and I want to be careful here because the temptation is a little too strong to trust. He became famous for one bleak idea, that we are set down in a universe that will not answer us, that we call out for meaning and get only silence back. And it is nearly impossible not to hear, underneath that cosmic silence, the plain domestic silence of a Belcourt flat, a father who could not speak because he was dead, a mother who did not because she could not, a mute uncle, and an enormous unsayable love that filled the rooms and never found a word, a whole picture of the universe that seems to begin at a window in the fading light. I don't think it is really that simple. Ideas are almost never just the childhoods they grow from, and plenty of children raised in silence never think a philosophical thought in their lives. But I don't think it is nothing either. Long before Camus had the words absurd or revolt, he had lived the thing those words would try to catch. He knew in his body what it is to face something you love that will not speak back, and he knew, just as surely, that you go on loving it anyway. People forget that second half. The boy at the window did not love his mother less because she could not answer him. If anything, he loved her more. You could tell all of this as a story of pure deprivation, and many have. A fatherless boy in a slum, half-starved of language and wholly starved of books, marked so early and so deep by absence that he would go on hunting the missing voice for the rest of his days, in his mother, in the God he could not believe in the wide sky over the sea, and be answered by none of them. Told that way, everything he ever wrote is a single wound that would not close. He would not let you tell it that way, and this is the first real surprise about him. He refused his whole life to be pitied for where he came from. He never pitied the poverty and never pretended those rooms were anything but poor, and yet he insisted, almost stubbornly, that he had been a rich child, not in spite of the poverty, but right beside it, because just past the door lay Algiers, and the sea was a short walk down the hill, and the beaches, the harbour, the enormous African sun fell on the poor and the comfortable in exactly equal measure, and charged no one a thing. He wrote, looking back, that he had grown up halfway between poverty and the sun, the poverty keeping him from ever believing the world owed him anything, the sun teaching him that the world, silent as it was still worth loving with the whole of your body. The two never cancelled. He carried both, unreconciled, to the end. So let the question of whether that childhood was a wound or a gift stand where it is, because he would tell you it was plainly both, and that the mistake is imagining you must choose. What he took from those rooms was stranger and more useful than pity or nostalgia. He came away with a discovery made before he was old enough to name it, that silence and love are not enemies. You can stand beside something that will never speak to you, never explain itself, never promise it was all for a reason, and still, without telling yourself a single lie, be glad you are there. That is nearly the whole of what he would one day say about the universe. He worked it out first about his mother, at a window, in the dark. The room around you now is quiet too. It is late, the house has gone still, and there is no voice explaining anything to you either. Only the dark, the sound of your own breathing, and whatever love you happen to be carrying that you have never entirely found the words for. You don't have to find them tonight. You can lie here in the quiet the way that boy lay in his, and let it be enough that the quiet is a warm one. There was more than silence in that childhood, though. There was light, a great deal of it, hard and golden and lying over everything, and it was down at the shore, in the salt and the heat and the shock of cold water, that the other half of the man was made. Go down the hill from those 2 rooms, past the last of the houses and the tram lines, and there, all at once, is the sea. For a boy who owned almost nothing, it was the one thing he owned outright. He could not buy a book or a new pair of shoes, but he could walk to the water on any burning afternoon, pull off his shirt and hand his whole body over to it. The shock of the cold after the heat of the sand, the salt drying tight across his skin as he lay on the rocks, the sun coming down like a warm hand pressed flat against his back. You have felt some version of this, even if you grew up 1,000 miles from any coast, the animal simplicity of a body in water or in sunlight, when for a few minutes there is no thought left in you at all, only warmth and cold and light, and the plain fact of being alive. That was the ground he built everything on. A sensation older and surer than any idea he would ever have. Long before he had read a page of philosophy, this poor child of Algiers knew in his skin that the world was worth loving. Not because it made sense, or because there would be a reward waiting at the end of it, but simply worth loving, the way the sea is worth swimming in, for its own sake right now. And then it is over. It was a kind of paganism, though he was too young to have a word for it, the old Mediterranean feeling, nearer to the Greeks than to any church, that this life, this hour, this body in the water, is the whole of what any of us gets, and that there is no realer life waiting elsewhere to redeem it. There was no heaven in it, and it did not seem to need one. The heat on your shoulders at 4 in the afternoon does not require an afterlife to be worth having. There was even a place that gathered all of it into one spot, a ruined Roman town along the coast west of the city called Tipasa, where broken columns lie half-buried in wild wormwood, and the sea comes right up to the stones. He went there to lie in the sun among the ruins, breathing the bitter green smell of the plants and the salt, and it was as near as he ever came to feeling at home in the universe, welcomed by it, married to it. He would spend some of his best sentences trying to catch what those afternoons were: the ruins, the sun, the sea, a young body among the stones, and no gods anywhere but the ones you could feel on your own skin. And here is what people miss when they picture him later as some gloomy figure in a grey raincoat. The joy came first, and the joy was total, and it was precisely because he loved being alive this much that its ending would strike him, always, as an outrage he could not get over. He wrote, in his 20s, that there is no love of life without despair of life, that the two are one thing, that only the person who never wants the day to end feels the full weight of the door closing. The sun did not shield him from the darkness, it sharpened it, but it also handed him something to set against the darkness that he would never, for the rest of his life, be argued out of. 2 men reached into that bright, bookless childhood and changed the direction it was heading. The first was a primary school teacher named Louis Germain. Louis Germain. In the ordinary run of things, a boy like Albert left school at 12 or 14 and went out to work because the family needed the wages and his grandmother fully intended to send him out to earn them. Stand where the boy stood for a moment, bright, poor, and entirely unaware that your whole future is being settled in a room you are not allowed into, in a conversation between a schoolteacher and your grandmother. Germain saw what the child could do and refused to let it be thrown away. He went to the apartment and argued with the old woman. He coached the boy for free in the evenings for the scholarship examination that led to the lycée, the one a family like theirs could never have paid for. And the boy won it. That single act, one underpaid man deciding that this particular mind would not be spent on a warehouse floor, is the hinge the entire life turns on. Decades later, when word came that he had won the Nobel Prize, the highest honor the world of letters can hand a person, one of the first things Camus did before any of the ceremonies was sit down and write a letter to Louis Germain. He told the old man that without him, without the affectionate hand he had once held out to a small poor child, none of it would ever have happened. I have read that letter more than once, and I still cannot get all the way through it evenly. There is something almost too much to bear in a man standing at the summit of his life and turning around, first thing, to thank the person who set him on the bottom step. The second man arrived later, at the lycée and beyond it, a philosophy teacher named Jean Grenier, who did for the boy's mind what Germain had done for his chances. Grenier lent him books, took his early writing seriously when he was still a rough provincial boy, and put into his hands a slim volume of his own essays that struck the young Camus, by his own account, like a door swinging open onto a room he had never known was there. Grenier gave him Nietzsche and the Greeks and the whole luminous, melancholy notion of the Mediterranean as a way of thinking and not merely a place to swim. If Germain saved the boy from the warehouse, Grenier turned the saved boy into a writer. Camus kept him as a friend for the rest of his life and dedicated some of his most serious books to him. There was one more school in that childhood, and it met on a strip of bare ground around a ball. Camus played football, and he played in goal, partly, he confessed, because a goalkeeper wears through his shoes more slowly than the boys sprinting the length of the pitch, and in a house where his grandmother checked the soles for damage, that was no small thing. He loved the game without a shred of irony, the way you love things at 15, and near the end of his life he said, in complete earnest, that what he knew most surely about morality and the obligations we owe one another, he had learned less from any book than from a patch of grass with a ball on it. It sounds like a charming line until you sit with what the game actually teaches a poor boy, that the ball rarely comes exactly where you expect it, that you cannot win the thing alone, that you hold the position you are given and do your honest part so the others can do theirs, and that there is a kind of loyalty that has nothing to do with the score. You do not let the side down. That plain rule would run underneath his politics and his books long after his body could no longer play the game. There is a serious objection to all of this, one that shadowed Camus his entire career, and it deserves to stand at its full height rather than be waved off. A hard-headed thinker looks at the sun and the sea and the swimming and says plainly, "This is not philosophy, this is a temperament." A man born somewhere cold and grey, who had to reason his way through the long dark of a northern winter, does not get to dissolve the problem of a meaningless universe by taking off his shirt and going for a swim. That Mediterranean glow running through everything Camus wrote, the insistence that the body's joy is answer enough, is no hard-won conclusion at all, only a lucky accident of climate and good health, a beautiful hedonism dressed up as wisdom. It is part of why some of the most rigorous minds of his century never fully counted him as one of them. He feels, they said. He does not argue. The charge has real teeth, and I don't mean to pull them. it is fair to ask whether a philosophy of sunlight can survive being carried indoors, into a hospital, into a war, into old age, and whether the yes he learned on the beach was courage or only luck. But notice what the objection quietly takes for granted. That thinking done with the body is not truly thinking, that only the mind alone in the dark, sealed off from the world, is to be taken seriously. Camus spent his life refusing that very split. He would say that the swimmer who knows the water is cold and the summer is ending, and who loves both anyway, has grasped something the philosopher in the locked room has merely talked himself out of. Whether he was right about that is not a thing I can settle for you, and it may be the single most important question anyone can put to him. He did not believe the sun was an escape from the truth. He believed it was one of the few true things we are actually given, and that any philosophy which had to deny it in order to sound deep had gone wrong somewhere near the beginning. So he came into his young manhood carrying an odd sort of fortune, a body that loved the world without needing a reason. Two men who had shown him that a poor boy's mind could travel anywhere it liked, and a simple faith learned in salt water and on scuffed grass, that life was good and that you did not let the side down. He had the yes. He had it early and he had it whole, before he owned any argument to prop it up or had met any real trouble to test it against. What he did not yet know was whether a yes like that, resting on nothing but sunlight and youth and a strong heart, could hold when the world finally came for it. He would not have long to wait. For now, though, let it stay simple. Let your own body be for a moment the way his was on those afternoons, heavy, warm, loose, nothing at all required of it. Your breathing has already slowed since we began, and you don't need to do anything about that, only notice it and let it keep slowing. Whatever you carried up the long hill of this day, you can set it down here at the edge of the water. The sun he loved went out of the world long ago, and so did the boy, but the thing the two of them made together turns out to be strangely portable. The sense, underneath all the hard questions, that being alive is not a problem to be solved, but a warmth to be felt, for exactly as long as it lasts. Feel it, lasting now. There will be time enough for the cold. The cold he had been promised did not wait for old age, and it did not fall from the sky. It came from inside his own chest, on an ordinary afternoon when he was 17, and it came as blood. He was coughing the way anyone coughs, and then there was blood in it, bright red and wet and unmistakable, and the afternoon simply stopped. Blood from the lungs, in 1930, meant one word, and the word was tuberculosis, what the older people still called consumption, the slow white plague that had emptied so many houses that everyone knew its face on sight. There were no antibiotics yet. The medicine that would one day blunt the disease lay more than a decade in the future, far too late to spare the frightened boy anything that was coming. To have it at 17 was to be handed, without ceremony, a sentence with no fixed date. Maybe months, maybe years, maybe, if the luck held and you rested and rested again, a long and shadowed life, but always with the thing alive inside you, always with the knowledge that it could rise again at any hour and finish what it had started. The treatment was nearly as hard as the disease. To rest a diseased lung, the doctors would drive a needle between his ribs and pump air into the space around it, pressing the lung down flat so it could not move, and so they hoped could heal, a procedure they would repeat on him again and again across the years, refilling the space as the air was absorbed, holding half of his breathing still. Picture being 17 and strong and in love with the sea, and lying on a table while a man quietly collapses one of your lungs with a needle. The body that had been his one great possession, the instrument of every joy he had, the thing he carried down to the water on burning afternoons, that same body had turned silently and from within into the thing that was going to kill him. It took first the football, A goalkeeper needs his lungs like anyone else, and the boy who had loved the game without a shred of irony was finished with it at an age when most players are only starting. And it took, in time, something he had wanted even more. He had meant to be a teacher, to sit where Germain and Grenier had sat, to make a modest, honourable life inside the world of books that had rescued him. But to teach in the French schools, you had to pass a national examination, and to sit that examination you had to be certified sound in body by a doctor, and a young man with tuberculosis in his file could not be certified sound. So the door he had been walking toward his whole short life, the door his teachers had pried open for him, swung shut on medical grounds, on a technicality of the lungs. He would have to become whatever he became by some other road. Journalism, the theatre, the blank page, the roads still open to a clever poor man with a bad chest and no permission to teach. And here is the thing that matters most about that 17-year-old with blood on his handkerchief. The thing that sets him apart from nearly every other philosopher who ever wrote about death. He did not arrive at the fact of mortality by thinking. He did not read his way to it, or reason his way to it, or come to it late and second-hand in a comfortable room. He coughed it up. Before he had a single idea about the meaning or meaninglessness of life, he had the taste of his own death in his mouth, at an age when death is supposed to be a rumour about other people. Everything he would later write about the absurd, about a life that ends inside a universe that will not say why, he had already lived, wordlessly, in his own chest, years before he found any language for it. The absurd was never an argument he found clever. It was a fact he had survived. I have wondered more than once what that does to a person. Most of us are handed the same knowledge eventually, that we are going to die, that the body is on loan, that the sun will go on without us. But we are handed it slowly, in installments, with long stretches in between where we manage to forget. And by the time we can no longer forget, we have had decades to build our defences. He got the whole of it at 17 in a single afternoon, with no defences built at all. You may know a smaller version of that day yourself, the first time your body did something frightening, and you understood, in a way you never quite lost again, that it was not going to last forever and was not entirely yours to command. The world does not look the same afterward. It sharpens. Every ordinary thing, a glass of water, a square of sunlight on a wall, a person's face across a table, takes on the strange brightness of things that are not going to be here, or that you are not going to be here to see for long. When he was well enough to study again, he went up to the university in Algiers and wrote, of all things, a long essay on the meeting of Greek philosophy and early Christianity. On Plotinus, Plotinos, the last great pagan mystic, and on St. Augustine, the man who welded the Greek longing to the Christian God. It is worth stopping on that choice, because it is stranger than it looks. The future prophet of a world without God spent his student years living inside the mind of Christianity's most powerful convert, and he did not study Augustine as an enemy. He studied him from the inside with real sympathy, the way you study something you find beautiful and cannot bring yourself to accept. Augustine is exactly the objection this chapter has to face, because Augustine too had been a young man on this same North African coast, some 15 centuries earlier, in love with the flesh and the sun and the good things of the world. Augustine too came up hard against his own smallness and his own death, and the ache of a heart that nothing on earth could finally satisfy. And Augustine looked at all of it and drew the opposite conclusion from the one Camus would draw. He decided the restlessness was a clue, that a heart which nothing in the world can satisfy must have been built for something beyond the world, that we are homesick, every one of us, for God, and wretched only until we rest in him. The same coast, the same sun, the same collision with death. Two men and two answers that could not stand further apart. This is what you have to hold on to whenever anyone tells you that Camus' philosophy simply came out of his lungs, that the blood at 17 produced the man. It did not, and it could not, because facing your death does not hand you your conclusions. It hands you the question and leaves the answer to you. Stand in front of that darkness yourself for a moment and feel how genuinely open the road is. You can decide, as Augustine did, that the ache is a sign you were made for something more, or you can decide, as Camus did, that there is nothing more and love the sun regardless. Nothing in the fear itself tells you which way to turn. Camus chose to keep the sun and refuse the God who might have explained it, to stand where Augustine stood and decline the comfort Augustine seized was an act of will, not a symptom of illness. And that leaves a hard question hanging over him that never quite goes away. Was the refusal courage, the honesty of a man who would not believe what he could not honestly believe? Or was it its own kind of flinching, a proud inability to be consoled, wearing the mask of truth? I don't think he ever fully answered that for himself. I'm not certain it can be answered from the outside at all. What is certain is that the illness set the terms for everything that came after. He walked out of it with the yes still in him, that stubborn, sunlit love of being alive that no needle and no diagnosis had managed to kill. But the yes now had to live in the same body as a death sentence, in full sight of the end, with no God to promise that the end was not the end. Loving life had been effortless down on the beaches. Now it would have to be chosen in the dark, against everything he knew. The whole of his work, from this point on, is the record of a man trying to keep saying yes to a life he had every reason to curse, without lying to himself about a single thing. That is a heavy thing to carry, and you do not have to carry it now. The knowledge that came to him in one afternoon at 17 is the kind that keeps. It will still be here in the morning, and it will still be here long after that, and there is nothing you need to do about it tonight. Let the frightened boy rest, wherever he is now. Let your own body, whatever it has told you or not yet told you about its plans, simply lie here and breathe in the dark, unhurried and unthreatened, for this one night. He would spend years turning the blood in his chest into a clear and steady idea, and he would give that idea a name. But the naming can wait until it is light. For now there is only the breath going out and coming back, going out and coming back, and the quiet and you. There is a rhythm that most lives fall into, and you know it from the inside. You wake to an alarm. You wash, you dress, you travel to the place where you spend the daylight. You do the work that is set in front of you. You eat, you travel back, you eat again, you sleep, and the alarm returns you to the beginning. Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday, the same shape each time, the week closing over you like water, and the years going by underneath in a way you mostly do not look at, because looking is not required and there is always the next thing to be done. And then, one perfectly ordinary morning, for no reason you could name, the whole arrangement quietly comes apart in your hands. You are standing in the same kitchen, holding the same cup, and a single word rises up from somewhere underneath all of it. Why? Why this? Why any of it? Why the whole patient machinery of getting up and going on? Nothing has happened. No one has died. Nothing is broken. The coffee is exactly as warm as it was yesterday. But the automatic sense of it, the sense that had been carrying you along without your ever having to supply it yourself, has drained out of the scene, and for a moment you are looking at your own life the way you might look at a stranger's from across a room, wondering what on earth it is all for. Camus knew that morning well, and he thought it was one of the most important experiences a person can have, because of what it quietly reveals. Notice first what did not happen. You did not learn a new fact. Everything in that kitchen was there the day before and will be there tomorrow. What changed was not the world, and not exactly you, but the fit between the two of you, the quiet agreement, usually so smooth you never feel it, between your need for the day to mean something and the day's willingness to mean it. For one moment, the agreement lapsed, and you saw the gap that had been there the whole time. That gap is what he called the absurd, and it is worth getting exactly right, because nearly everyone gets it a little wrong. The absurd is not a quality of the universe. The universe is not absurd. It is simply silent, going about its enormous business of stars and weather and slow decay without any reference to us, neither for us nor against us, just there. And the absurd is not a quality of you either. It is not the same thing as being sad or tired or depressed. It lives in neither of you alone. It is the collision between the two, between a creature that cannot stop asking for meaning and a world that will not answer. Take away one side, and it vanishes. A cat in that same kitchen feels no absurdity because it makes no demand for the morning to add up. And a person who is certain that a loving God authored every detail of the scene feels no absurdity either, because for them, the world does answer in a voice they trust. The absurd is the particular predicament of a mind that keeps asking why into a silence that keeps not replying. It is a divorce, he said, and like every divorce, it is a relationship and not a thing, the strained permanent relationship between our hunger and the world's quiet. He collected small versions of it the way other writers collect phrases. A man is talking on a telephone behind a pane of glass. You cannot hear a word. You only see the mouth working and the hand cutting shapes in the air. And all at once, the whole performance looks senseless, and you catch yourself wondering why he is alive, why any of us keeps up the elaborate dumb show. Nothing is wrong with the man. The strangeness is not in him. It appears in the space between his sealed-off gestures and your sudden, wordless demand that they amount to something, which is to say, it appears exactly where the absurd always appears, in the gap and nowhere else. He was not the first to stand in that silence. 3 centuries before him, a brilliant and devout Frenchman named Blaise Pascal, looked up at the new picture of the cosmos the astronomers had just unrolled, an emptiness with no edge and no center and no obvious place in it for a human being, and he wrote a sentence that has never stopped being frightening. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. Pascal felt precisely what Camus would later name the smallness of a thinking speck inside an immensity that says nothing back. He even found the one scrap of dignity in it that Camus would seize on too. The human being, though the universe can crush him without noticing, is somehow greater than the thing that crushes him because he knows that he is being crushed and the universe knows nothing at all. A reed, Pascal called us, the weakest thing in nature, but a reed that thinks. Pascal was terrified. It is worth being honest, though, about how this idea actually feels to the rest of us, because the word absurd makes it sound bleak, the private property of gloomy people in black clothing, and that is a genuine misunderstanding. The strange thing, when the absurd truly arrives in your own kitchen, is that it rarely feels like sinking. More often it feels like waking. The stage set that slips does not reveal an abyss so much as a clarity, a sudden and almost bracing honesty about where you really are. The first time it landed on me with any weight, what I felt was not despair. It was something closer to relief, the relief of finally seeing plainly a thing I had been half managing not to see. That is the odd secret at the center of Camus. That lucidity, even about hard things, is not the enemy of peace. Still, the moment the silence opens, you are standing at a crossroads whether you want it to be or not, and there are really only a few ways to go. You can do what almost all of us do almost all of the time, which is to hurry, reach for your phone, start the next task, let the warm machinery of habit close back over the gap until it is smooth again and forgotten. Or you can fill the silence with a voice and decide that there is, after all, someone on the other end, a God whose answer you cannot hear yet but can trust. Or you can do the rarest and most uncomfortable thing of the three, which is to stay there in the open question, refusing both the distraction and the consolation, and simply keep looking at what is actually the case. Camus wanted that third road, but it has a serious rival, and the rival comes from a man who understood the absurd as deeply as anyone who has ever lived. He was a Danish thinker named Kierkegaard, from the century before Camus, and he put that word, the absurd, at the very center of his own work and drew from it the opposite conclusion. Kierkegaard agreed completely that reason runs into a wall, that the gap between what the heart demands and what the world can prove is one no argument will ever bridge. But he did not think the gap was a dead end. He thought it was a door. Precisely because you cannot reason your way across, he said, faith is the leap you make with no bridge beneath you. You believe in spite of the evidence, exactly because the evidence can never compel you by virtue of the absurd itself. He pointed to Abraham on the mountain, the knife raised over his own son, obeying a command that made no earthly sense, trusting out past the edge of everything reason could endorse. That, for Kierkegaard, was faith at its purest, not the cozy assurance that the world makes sense, but a wide-awake, terrible trust flung across the very silence that had terrified Pascal. It is not a weak position. In its way, it stares harder into the void than the person who merely shrugs, because it refuses to look away and then leaps anyway. And this is where Camus has to make the hardest move of his life, because he heard Kierkegaard clearly, admired the sheer courage of the leap, and still would not take it. He would not fill the silence with a voice he could not honestly hear. Why he refused, what he believed was quietly dishonest about the leap, even at its bravest, is the hinge his entire philosophy turns on, and it is not a thing to rush past in the dark. For now it is enough to feel the shape of where he has brought us, to a silence that is real, that great and honest minds have stood inside and answered in opposite ways, and to a question that, once you have genuinely seen it, you can no longer pretend you never saw, but you can set it down. That is the mercy of the hour you are in, the why that feels so enormous at noon, that can stop you cold in a bright kitchen, grows strangely light as the body grows heavy, and you may be feeling a little of that already. The question still there but loosened, its grip going soft, no longer insisting on an answer tonight. Let it loosen. The silence of the world is not angry with you. It was never angry. It is only quiet, and quiet is something you already know how to rest inside. So rest inside it now. The question will keep. It has kept for 300 years and more, and it will still be there, patient and unanswered, whenever you decide to open your eyes and take it up again. Sooner or later, anyone who has once looked straight at that silence arrives at the edge of a single question, and it is not an abstract one. Picture a person at a window late at night, the house quiet behind them, looking out at nothing in particular and asking, without any drama, whether it is worth going on at all. Not planning anything by it, only asking. Whether the whole business of being alive, now that it has stopped explaining itself, is something a person should keep choosing to do. Camus opened his most important book by walking straight up to that window instead of tiptoeing around it. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, he wrote, and that is suicide. Judging whether or not life is worth living is the fundamental question of philosophy, he said, and everything else, how many worlds there are, what the mind is made of, all the grand tangled puzzles the professors love, comes afterward, if it comes at all. It is a startling way to begin a work of philosophy, and I will admit, it is the sentence that first made me trust him. Most thinkers keep a careful distance from the one question a person might actually stake a life on. He put it on the first page in the plainest words he could find and refused to look away. And he wrote it, it is worth remembering, at the worst imaginable moment to be arguing that life is worth living. It was the start of the 1940s. A whole continent was going down into war and mass death, and the question of whether existence could be born was not a seminar topic, but a thing being answered, in the negative, in millions of lives at once. The man asking it was himself under a quiet sentence, his lungs already marked, never more than a bad season from the end. Set yourself down at his desk for a moment, not yet 30, your body failing, the world darkening at every window, and you are about to argue against every piece of evidence in front of you that a person should choose to stay alive. He had every personal reason to give the bleak answer. What makes the whole thing worth our attention is that he did not. His answer to the window was no, do not do it. But the interesting part is why, because he did not reach for any of the usual comforts to say it. He did not tell you that things get better, or that you are needed, or that some plan is unfolding which you simply cannot see yet. He said something stranger, and in its way sturdier. He said that killing yourself is not an answer to the absurd, because it does not solve the absurd, it only abolishes it. Remember what the absurd actually is, the standoff between a mind that asks for meaning and a world that stays silent. Suicide ends that standoff by removing one of the two parties. It does not win the argument. It walks out of the room and calls that winning. To die by your own hand, he thought, is to decide the tension is unbearable, and to end it by ending yourself, which is to hand the silence a last word it never even asked for. And Camus did not want the silence to have the last word. He wanted to keep the confrontation alive, eyes open, and go on. Simply to keep living, awake, refusing to be reconciled, was already the first small act of defiance, the seed of everything else he had to say. But there was a second way out of the tension, quieter and far more respectable, and he was just as unwilling to take it. You can end the standoff from the other side. Instead of removing yourself, you can remove the silence by deciding that the world is not really silent after all, that there is a voice behind it, a God, a hidden order, a meaning waiting just past the reach of proof. This is the leap we watched Kierkegaard make, that brave flight across the gap, and Camus, with real nerve, gave it a hard name. He called it suicide too. Philosophical suicide, he said, the killing not of the body, but of the honest clarity that had brought you to the edge in the first place. The leper reaches the abyss, cannot bear it, and builds a bridge out of the same hope the abyss had just stripped away. He found the same move, dressed in different robes, all through the serious thought of his day. A Russian named Shestov, who stared as hard into the absurd as anyone alive, and then declared that reason itself must be sacrificed so that a God for whom all things are possible could be leapt toward. And others, some of the most rigorous minds of the age, each arriving at the silence and then, at the last second, quietly inventing a flaw beneath it. So Camus refused both deaths. He would not kill his body to escape the tension, and he would not kill his clarity to escape it either. He would not walk out of the room, and he would not pretend the room was other than it was. He would stay, awake, holding both halves of the impossible thing at once, the hunger that will not go quiet, and the world that will not answer, and he would resolve it by no exit at all, neither the final one nor the consoling one, which sounds, when you first hear it, like a sentence to hard labour. Stand there forever, wanting meaning, getting silence, and do not flinch. But here the whole thing turns, and turns toward life, because Camus insisted that refusing both exits does not leave you with nothing. It leaves you, he said, with three things, and they are not small. It leaves you with revolt, the plain dignity of a person who keeps looking clearly at their own condition and refuses to be reconciled to it, a defiance that needs no hope at all to keep burning. It leaves you with a strange freedom, because once you stop waiting on some grand eternal purpose to tell you how to live, once you give up the future as the place where it will all finally pay off, you are handed back the present, free, with nothing to lose and therefore nothing left to be afraid of losing. And it leaves you with passion, a hunger to live not correctly but fully, to have as much of this life as your two hands can hold, since sheer quantity of living is the one wealth still on offer to a person who has given up being paid in meaning. Not the best life, the most life. Revolt, freedom and passion wrung out of the very silence that was supposed to defeat you. I have to be honest that there is a serious objection here, and it does not go down easily. Is any of this actually livable? It is a fine thing to say on the page that a person should hold the absurd open forever, awake, unconsoled, defiant. But people are not built to run at that pitch of lucidity for long. Ask yourself whether you could truly do it, not for a bracing afternoon, but for a whole life, wanting meaning and taking only silence, and never once reaching for a comfort. Most of us need some meaning, some hope, some story, simply to get up in the morning. And it is fair to wonder whether Camus is describing a way of life, or only a heroic pose that would crack the first time real grief or real illness came through the door. There is a sharper version of the doubt as well. If revolt and freedom and passion are things worth living for, then hasn't he quietly carried meaning back in through a side door and called his new values by other names, so that he is not really living without meaning at all, only with a prouder and lonelier kind? I do not think he ever fully closed that objection. I am not sure I could live the way he asks for more than a day at a time, and I suspect, if he was honest, that he could not always live it either. What he was offering in the end was less a proof than a discipline, a way of standing rather than a thing to believe. He was not promising that a life without appeal would be easy or even entirely possible. He was saying it was the one road that did not require lying, and that a person who managed to walk even part of it would find, to their own surprise, that the view from there was not despair, but a fierce and clear-eyed gratitude for being alive at all. Whether he was right, whether a whole human life can actually be built on ground that narrow, is not a thing you settle in an argument. It is a thing you can only find out by living, which is, of course, exactly what he wanted you to go and do. And you are doing it, this very minute, whether you meant to or not. You are still here, in the quiet, still breathing, which is already the small, stubborn yes he was talking about. No grand decision, only a staying. The room has not changed at all since we began. The same dark, the same walls, the same patient night. What has changed is only the weight of the question in your hand. It has gone from something that could stop a person cold at a window to something you can hold loosely in an open palm and set down and take up again in the morning if you still want it. There is nothing to decide tonight. He argued all of this into being with words, but he was not finished with words. He wanted to make a man you could actually watch live it, a man who would not lie, not even to save his own life, and he set him down on a beach under the same enormous sun that had made the rest of us. That beach and that sun are where the story ends. It begins somewhere much quieter, with a short flat sentence that has been unsettling readers for the better part of a century. Mother died today. Or maybe yesterday, I don't know. The man saying it is called Meursault, a young clerk in Algiers, and he has just had a telegram from the home where his mother lived, telling him she is gone. He goes to the funeral. He sits through the long vigil beside her coffin in the heat, and he does not cry. He smokes a cigarette by the body. He drinks a cup of coffee that someone offers him. He notices that he is tired and that the sun is fierce, and at one point he nearly dozes. He cannot quite remember how old she was. The day after he buries her, he goes down to the sea for a swim, runs into a young woman he used to know, takes her to a comedy at the cinema, and brings her home to his bed. He is not being cruel. That is the strange thing about him, the thing that gets under your skin. He is not cold in the way a cruel person is cold. He simply will not manufacture a feeling he does not have, or say a word he does not mean. And so at the exact moments when the rest of us reach for the sob, the solemn face, the right thing to say, he reaches for nothing, because there is nothing there, and he will not pretend that there is. You know that gap better than you might want to admit. Nearly everyone has stood at a graveside or a bedside or in the middle of some occasion built to crack them open and felt, instead of the great expected wave, a flat and guilty nothing, a numbness where the grief was scheduled to be, the mind wandering off to the heat or to lunch or to the shine on someone's shoes. And nearly everyone in that moment has done the decent human thing, which is to arrange their face and perform the feeling anyway, because that is the contract, that is how we hold one another up. Meursault is simply the man who will not sign the contract. He is you, in the second before you fix your expression, if you had never learned to fix it at all. For most of one hot Sunday, that refusal costs him nothing. He goes with a rough neighbour and the young woman to a friend's beach house on the coast, and there is trouble waiting there, a simmering quarrel the neighbour has carried along with him, and two men who have been following them. Later, alone, dazed by the heat, Meursault walks back across the burning sand and comes upon one of those men by a rock near a little spring. Nothing needs to happen. He could turn around. But the sun is enormous, pressing down on him, the same African sun that has meant nothing but joy in this story until now, and it is in his eyes, and the light breaks off the blade of the other man's knife in one blinding flash, and the sweat runs down into his eyes like a curtain of hot tears, and the whole sky seems to split open and rain fire, and Meursault, barely aware that he is doing it, pulls the trigger of a revolver he happens to be carrying, and the man drops. Then he does the thing no reading has ever quite explained away. He fires 4 more shots into the body lying still on the sand. I have read that page many times, and I have never gotten used to those 4 extra shots. Whatever we finally decide about this man, they are always there. And there is something else on that page the book never repairs, and I want to name it plainly. The man Meursault kills has no name. He is called throughout only the Arab. He has no history, no voice, no mother of his own whose funeral we ever hear about. He is a body on a beach, a plot point in a French clerk's crisis of the soul. And the silence around him is a genuine flaw at the heart of a great book, one that would come back long after Camus was gone to trouble everything the novel is admired for. What happens after the arrest is the part Camus most wanted you to see. At the trial, the strangest thing occurs. The killing itself almost drops out of view. What the court cannot forgive, what the prosecutor circles back to again and again until the jurors' faces harden, is not the dead man on the sand. It is the dry eyes at the funeral. Every fact they raise is perfectly accurate. He did not cry. He did drink the coffee by the coffin. He did take a woman to a comedy the day after and bring her to his bed. A man who would not weep for his own mother, the prosecutor thunders, a man with no soul and no remorse and nothing human in him, is a monster who as good as killed her himself, a danger to the whole of society who must lose his head. Meursault sits and listens to his life rearranged into the biography of a criminal, and the maddening truth is that every detail is true. If it were you in that dock, and one performed sob, a single good lie well told, would lift the sentence of death from your neck, I think most of us would tell it, and be right to. He will not. He would rather die true than live false, and so the court, which might well have forgiven an ordinary murderer, cannot forgive a man who refuses to play the game, and it sends him to the blade. That is Camus' real subject, and it is why he could say, with a straight face and a little deliberate provocation, that this passive, unheroic clerk was a kind of martyr. Meursault is the absurd walking around in a body. He is a man who has quietly let go of all the consoling stories, who takes the world exactly as it is, silent and physical and finite, who will not inflate a feeling or fake a grief or claim a love he cannot honestly vouch for, and who is willing, when it comes to it, to be killed rather than lie. Society runs on precisely the performances he withholds. It can absorb a great deal of violence, but it cannot absorb a man who tells the plain truth about how little he feels, because that truth holds a mirror up to everyone else's performance, and the reflection is unbearable. The book ends with the one time Meursault loses his calm. A chaplain comes to his cell again and again, pressing him to turn to God, to repent, to believe that this life is not the end. And Meursault, who has been mild through everything, finally erupts and pours out his refusal. There is no other life, there is only this one. Every living person is condemned exactly as he is, and merely does not yet know the date, and not one of the priest's certainties is worth a single strand of a real woman's hair. And then, spent, emptied out, with the sentence of death sitting quietly beside him, he does the last thing anyone expects. Lying there in the dark, he opens himself to what he calls the tender indifference of the world. He takes in the night and the stars and the smell of the earth, and he understands that the world is not against him and never was, that it is simply indifferent, as blank and as vast as he is himself, and that this makes it, of all things, a kind of brother. And feeling that, he finds that he has been happy and is happy still. A condemned man, hours from the guillotine, with no God and no future, lying in a cell, and what fills him is peace. You can take that ending as the most bracing thing in modern literature, or as its coldest, and honest readers have never stopped arguing over which. Because the same question hangs across the whole book, and simply will not settle. Is Meursault a hero, a man brave enough to live without a single lie, to love the bare world for exactly what it is, and to die for the truth of his own experience? Or is he a hollow man, someone from whom one essential thing has just been left out, whose famous honesty is only the flat readout of a soul that cannot be moved, that helped a brute torment a woman and fired 4 bullets into a corpse and grieved for no one ever? The unnerving part is how hard it is to hold him in either hand. The court that kills him is a machine of hypocrisy, and it is also perhaps reacting to something in him that really is absent. I have read this novel more times than I can count, and I still cannot tell you, with a steady hand, which of the 2 men he is. I have come to think the greatness of the book is that it will not let me. And perhaps it will not let you either, because the reason Meursault disturbs is that he is not far enough away. He is what remains of a person once you strip out all the performance, and each of us keeps far more performance running than we care to know. The dry-eyed minute at the funeral, the smile you did not feel, the sorry you did not mean and offered anyway, he is only that minute, stretched into a whole life, with nothing added on top. The question the book presses into your hands is not really about a fictional clerk in Algiers. It is how much of your own honesty you could actually stand to feel, and how much of what you call your feeling is only the face you have learned to make. For now, let that question go loose in the dark. Notice that your own body, lying here, asks nothing of you the way the courtroom asked of him. It does not need you to perform a single thing. It is only warm and breathing and heavy against the bed, honest in the plainest way a thing can be honest, simply by being here and being alive. Meursault came to his strange peace at the very end by letting the world be exactly what it was and lying down inside it. You can borrow that peace tonight without paying his terrible price. The world is indifferent, yes, but indifference, it turns out, is also another name for a thing that will never once ask you to pretend. And the man who wrote all this was not finished with the puzzle of how a person can be happy with a stone to push and no reason to push it. He had an older story in mind for that, the oldest one there is, about a man alone on a mountain. Watch the top of the mountain. The man has almost reached it, his whole body braced against the boulder, and for one moment the great stone balances at the summit, and then it tips the wrong way and goes, thundering down the far slope, gathering speed, bouncing, until it settles in the dust at the bottom, exactly where it began. The man straightens, wipes his face, and starts the long walk back down to the stone to begin again. He has done this more times than there are numbers, and he will do it forever. You have almost certainly heard his name, but let me tell you why he is on that mountain, because it is stranger than the punishment suggests. Sisyphus was a king and a famous trickster, and above all, a man who loved being alive more than he feared the gods. When death came for him, he chained death up so that for a while no one on earth could die at all. When the gods freed death and hauled him down into the underworld, he talked his way back out. He had arranged for his own burial rites to be neglected, then complained bitterly to the lords of the dead about the disrespect, and won their permission to return, just briefly, to set it right. And once he was back in the light, and felt the sun again, and the warm stones, and the sea, and the curve of the earth, he simply refused to go back down into the dark. He clung to this life with both hands until the gods came and took him by force. So the punishment was chosen with care. For a man who loved the world that much, they did not invent pain. They invented futility. They gave him a task with no possible end and no possible point, and set him to it for eternity, on the theory, as Camus put it, that there is no punishment more terrible than labour that is useless and hopeless. And here Camus does the thing that turned an old cautionary tale into the heart of his philosophy. He asks you not to watch the man strain upward, but to watch him come back down, because the climb is only effort, while the descent is thought. In that pause, that long walk down to the fallen stone, Sisyphus knows exactly what he is and exactly what is coming, and he goes anyway, and it is precisely there, in the full clear knowledge of his fate, that Camus finds him magnificent. If Sisyphus were a machine, there would be no story. A machine feels nothing and defies nothing. His torment is that he is awake. But that same wakefulness is the whole of his freedom, because a conscious man can do the one thing a rock cannot. He can look at his condition and refuse, on the inside, to be crushed by it. There is no fate, Camus says, that cannot be overcome by scorn. The gods can compel Sisyphus to push the stone. They cannot compel him to be miserable about it, cannot reach inside him and make him beg. And so, in the one territory still his own, the ground behind his own eyes, he wins. Then comes the move that is easy to miss and holds everything together. He makes the rock his own, not by pretending it is light, not by hoping it will one day stay at the top, but by accepting it completely, without illusion and without surrender, until the fate stops being something done to him and becomes simply his rock, his mountain, his own to carry, owned rather than merely suffered. The universe he moves in has no master now, no god handing down reasons. And yet, Camus insists, it is not empty. Each flake of stone on that dark mountain is its own small world. The struggle by itself, the sheer act of pushing against the weight, is enough to fill a human heart. And so he can write the sentence that has puzzled and consoled people for 80 years now. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happiness and the absurd, he says, are two children of the same earth, and you cannot have the second without the first being possible. You do not need the universe to mean something in order to be happy inside it. You need only to stop demanding the meaning, to take up your own particular weight, and to be entirely present in the pushing of it. If that sounds remote, a myth about a king and a boulder, look at your own week. You washed dishes that are dirty again. You answered messages that only bred more messages. You cleaned a room that is already, quietly, coming untidy, and cooked a meal that will need cooking again tomorrow, and travelled to the place where you work and then travelled home, and you will do all of it again and again for years, with no final morning when the last dish is washed and the task is complete and you are released. That is not some grim exception to a normal life. For most people, most of the time, that repetition simply is the life. Camus is not telling you to escape it, because you cannot. He is making the far stranger suggestion that you do not have to escape it in order to be happy, that you can, if you choose, stop waiting for the stone to stay put and just be here, awake, inside the pushing, and that this can be enough. Not everyone has been persuaded, though, and the sharpest challenge deserves to be met at full strength. A generation after Camus, an American philosopher named Thomas Nagel, agreed that the absurd is real, and then said that Camus had responded to it all wrong. The absurd, for Nagel, comes from a simple trick we can always play on ourselves. However seriously we throw our whole hearts into our lives, we can also step back and look at them from a great cold distance, from nowhere in particular, and from out there nothing we do seems to matter in the slightest. "Fine," said Nagel, "but look what follows. If, from that far vantage, nothing matters, then your heroic defiance does not matter either. The universe that will not applaud your success also will not be wounded by your scorn. To stand on the mountain shaking your fist at a sky that is not watching is not courage. It is a kind of self-importance, a refusal to notice how small the whole drama really is. The grown-up response to the absurd, Nagel thought, is neither heroism nor despair, but irony, a light and amused shrug, the ability to hold your own pointlessness without either weeping over it or building a monument to it. Why clench your jaw? He asks, at a joke. Better to smile. And there is a deeper cut still, one aimed straight at the famous sentence. Remember that Camus built his entire honesty on refusing the leap, on scorning the thinkers who reached the edge of the silence and then jumped to an unearned comfort. Now look hard at one must imagine Sisyphus happy, and ask where the happiness actually comes from. Nothing in the logic delivers it. The argument gets you to a man with a hopeless task and clear eyes. It does not get you by any necessary step to joy. Camus does not conclude that Sisyphus is happy. He commands it. One must imagine. Why must we? Is that word not doing exactly what the leap did, vaulting across a gap that reason cannot cross and landing on a consolation the evidence never supplied? The man who forbade the leap may have made one himself at the last moment, not toward God, but toward happiness. I have repeated that sentence to myself in some bad hours, and I still cannot honestly tell you whether it rescued me with a truth or with a beautiful lie. I lean, most days, toward truth. But I notice that I have to lean. Maybe that is the honest place to leave it, because the happiness of Sisyphus may not be the kind of thing anyone can prove from the outside. It is not a fact waiting to be verified. It is a stance, a way of taking hold of your own fate, and the taking is the whole of it. You either make the gesture or you do not, and no argument will make it for you. And notice, Sisyphus hurt no one but himself. His defiance was private, contained, a matter between one man and his stone. That same freedom, turned outward onto other people, could become something monstrous. But that is not tonight's trouble, and it can keep. What is yours tonight is gentler than any of it. Your own stone is at the bottom of the hill right now, at rest in the dark, and it is asking nothing of you. It will be there in the morning. It always is. You will put your shoulder to it again when it is light. But not now. Now you are allowed to be the man in the one part of the story Camus loved best, the part that is not the straining but the pause, the still moment at the top before the long walk down, when there is nothing to push and nothing to prove, and you are, for one breath, simply stronger than everything that waits for you. Rest in that pause. The question of whether he is happy and whether you can be will keep until the sun comes up. It has waited this long. Let it wait a little longer while you sleep. Sisyphus was safe to admire because his defiance stayed his own. He pushed his own stone, scorned his own gods, and the only person who ever lived inside his fate was himself. But take that same discovery, that the world is silent, that nothing above us hands down a meaning, that a free man owes the universe no obedience, and turn it the other way, outward, onto other people. Now it is not a man and his rock, it is a man and everyone else. And the picture that comes back is not noble at all. It is a nightmare. Camus knew this, and he was brave enough to write the nightmare himself. He made a play out of a man who took the absurd exactly as far as it would go, and the man he chose was an old Roman emperor named Caligula, Caligula. The play begins in grief. Caligula has just lost his sister, who was also the woman he loved, and her death has cracked something open in him. He vanishes for 3 days, wandering outside the city, and when he returns, he is calm and changed and far more frightening than before, because he has seen a simple thing and cannot unsee it. He says it in 5 words: men die, and they are not happy. That is his absurd. The same silence Meursault heard on the beach, the same divorce between what we long for and what the world will actually give. But Caligula is not a clerk in Algiers. He is an emperor with absolute power and no one standing above him, and from the truth he draws a conclusion that Sisyphus never dreamed of. If men die and are not happy, he reasons, then the world as it stands is a lie and a cruelty, and there is no God and no law over him to say otherwise. So he is free, completely and dizzyingly free, in a way no one has ever dared to be, because he alone has stopped pretending there are limits, and he sets out to use that freedom to force the whole world to see what he sees. He asks first for the impossible, half mad with logic, demanding the moon, an end to death, something that is not of this world, and when the impossible will not come, he takes the one thing left to a god who cannot have the moon, which is the power to destroy. He kills on a whim. He humiliates the powerful, seizes wives, empties the treasury, orders deaths by lottery, not out of ordinary appetite or ordinary spite, but as a lesson, a demonstration, a proof. He is teaching his people the truth of the absurd with a blade, showing them that nothing they love is safe, because nothing is protected, because nothing means anything, and a man who has truly understood that is free to do anything at all. Set him beside the man on the mountain, and the whole problem lies open. Sisyphus and Caligula have both looked into the same silence. Both have refused the comforting stories. Both are, in Camus's word, absurd men. But Sisyphus turns his freedom inward, taking hold of his own fate and asking nothing of anyone, while Caligula turns it outward and takes hold of everyone's. The scorn that stayed private in the one becomes public terror in the other. And the thing that should stop you cold is that on the level of pure logic, it is not at all obvious that Sisyphus is right and Caligula is wrong. They began from the same premise. Caligula simply had the nerve and the power to follow it all the way down. This is the abyss under Camus' own feet, and to his lasting credit, he did not pretend it wasn't there. He built the whole beautiful case of the absurd, the silence and the refusal of the leap and the freedom and the happiness of the man with his stone, and then he wrote Caligula to show you the monster that lives inside that same case. Because if nothing means anything, the sentence has no flaw. Nothing matters does not stop politely at, and so I will love my fate and harm no one. It runs straight on to, and so nothing I do to you matters either. The absurd, taken by itself and followed honestly to the end, does not forbid a single cruelty. That is not a small crack in the philosophy. That is the ground itself opening up. The nihilist knows this and puts the question to Camus with perfect fairness. You told us there is no God and no meaning handed down from anywhere. Very well. Then there is no moral law handed down either, since it came from exactly the same place. And if God does not exist, as one of Dostoevsky's, great tormented characters understood, then everything is permitted. Caligula did not betray your philosophy. He kept faith with it more ruthlessly than your gentle stone pusher ever did. So tell us, on your own godless ground, with no heaven to appeal to and no eternal law to point at, what exactly stops him? And here is the honest, uncomfortable fact. At this point in his life, Camus could not fully answer. He knew in his bones that murder was wrong, that Caligula was a horror and not a hero. He could not yet prove it. I will admit that I cannot cleanly refute Caligula either, standing on the bare absurd, and that this is the place in Camus where I stop feeling clever and start feeling afraid. And yet, try the thing yourself, right now, in the quiet. You have felt the small version of Caligula's thought on a tired or bitter day, the flat conviction that none of it matters, sliding toward the quiet temptation to stop trying, to let the rules go, to stop being careful with people. Everyone has stood at the top of that little slope. So take the coldest, true thought you have ever had, that in the end none of it counts, and try to ride it all the way down to Caligula's conclusion, that it would therefore be a matter of indifference to be cruel to the person sleeping in the next room, to a stranger, to anyone at all. You cannot do it. Something in you refuses before a single argument arrives, a flat and immediate no that rises up from underneath thought entirely. For most of us, that no is unshakable even when we cannot say where it comes from. And Camus came to believe that this refusal, this thing in you that rebels against cruelty even when your logic has run out of replies, was not a leftover scrap of religion or a failure of nerve. He came to think it was a clue, that the wall which stops Caligula might be built not out of a proof at all, but out of that instant, wordless no. Caligula, in the end, seems to know it too. His freedom eats itself. Total power over others, total permission, leads him by a straight road into loneliness and horror, and at last into arranging his own murder, because a logic that permits everything finally permits his own destruction as well. As the knives go in, he cries out that he is still alive, and almost in the same breath he confesses that his freedom was the wrong one, that he took a road he should never have taken, that he has arrived at nothing. Even the man who followed the absurd to its farthest edge stands there at the edge and admits it was a dead end. Which leaves the question hanging, larger and stranger than when we began. If not Caligula, then what? If the wall is not built from God, and not from the pure logic of the absurd, then out of what exactly? And can it possibly hold? That question kept Camus working for the rest of his life, but it is not a wall you have to build tonight. Notice, as you lie here, that the abyss which yawns so wide in the daylight has already begun to narrow, the way everything narrows as you grow heavy and the mind loosens its grip. You do not have to hold the whole of it. Hold only the small, sure thing you proved to yourself a moment ago, that you could not will the cruelty, that the no in you is real, that whatever Caligula was, you are not, and never could be. Camus was frightened by this same darkness, and he did not stay frightened. He went looking, patiently, for the thing that stops the fall, and in time he found the beginning of it. You can go looking with him when it is light, For now, let the Emperor and his terrible logic dissolve back into the dark where they belong, and keep for yourself only the quiet, no, and the warm room, and the sleep that is already on its way. The beginning of the answer did not arrive as a proof. It arrived as a story, and the story starts with rats. Picture an ordinary city on the Algerian coast, a place called Oran, a flat, hot, commercial town with its back half turned to the sea, where people work hard at making money and getting bored and do not think much about anything larger than that. One spring morning, a doctor steps out of his surgery, looks down, and finds a dead rat on the landing, and thinks little of it. But the next day there are more, and the day after that more still, and soon the rats are coming up out of the cellars and the sewers in their thousands, staggering into the open in broad daylight, spinning, bleeding from the mouth, and dying in the streets while the townspeople watch in disgust. Then the rats stop dying, and the people begin. It is the plague, though no one wants to say the word, because to say it is to admit it, and to admit it is to have to act. The authorities delay and reassure and quibble over language until there are too many dead to pretend any longer. And then the only thing left is the terrible thing. They close the gates. The whole city is sealed off from the world, no one allowed in or out, letters stopped, families split down the middle with some inside the walls and some outside them, and a town that a week ago was thinking about business and love and the summer bathing season becomes, overnight, a single locked room full of frightened people waiting to see who dies next. You hardly have to imagine what that is like, because you have lived it. Not so long ago, the whole world became, for a while, a version of Oran. The shut doors, the empty streets, the word on everyone's lips that no one wanted to say, the people you loved suddenly on the far side of a border you could not cross, the strange stretched time of a life on hold while something invisible moved through the population and took whom it took. And you will remember the other thing too, the thing Camus most wanted you to see. While some hoarded, and some hid, and some went looking for someone to blame, others simply got up every morning and went to work in the danger. The ones in the hospitals and the ambulances and the delivery vans, the ones who kept the water running and kept the sick company, not because they expected to win and not because anyone would thank them, but because it needed doing and they were the ones there to do it. That is the whole of Camus's answer, standing in a white coat. His central figure is a doctor named Rieu, Ray U.H., an unremarkable, tired, decent man who spends the length of the book fighting a disease he knows he cannot beat. He lances the swellings and sits with the dying and signs the certificates and goes home and washes and gets up and does it again, hundreds of times, with no hope of victory, because the plague is stronger than any one doctor and most of the people he touches will die anyway. He has no faith to hold him up. He expects no reward in this world or another. When someone asks him why he keeps at a fight that cannot be won, he does not give a speech. He says it is a matter of common decency, and when they ask what on earth decency is, he says that in his case he knows it consists in doing his job. That is all. There are sick people, and he is a doctor, and so he goes to them. It is the least heroic sentence imaginable, and I have come to think it is the truest thing Camus ever wrote, the small, quiet wall that finally holds against the emperor and his logic. Caligula asked what a man may do when nothing means anything, and answered, everything. Rieu, facing the same silence, the same death, the same absence of any god to set it right, answers differently. He says you go and help. Not because it is written anywhere that you must, but because there is a person suffering in front of you, and you are a person too, and the moment one person answers that way, something begins that Sisyphus, alone on his mountain, never had. Others gather. A stranger stranded in the city, who has looked hard at his own life, and resolved never again to stand on the side of the things that kill, organizes teams of ordinary volunteers to go into the worst of it, carrying out the dead and tending the dying at the plain risk of their own lives. A journalist trapped by the quarantine, frantic to escape and get back to the woman he loves across the sea, arranges his getaway and then, at the last moment, cannot take it, because he finds he would be ashamed to be happy alone while this is everyone's business. A shy clerk keeps the terrible records. None of them is a hero in the way the word usually means. They are frightened and ordinary, and they show up anyway. The solitary eye of the man with his stone becomes, without anyone announcing it, a we. And that we, Camus is saying, is the thing meaning could not give us and does not need to. You do not need the universe to care in order to care for one another. There is one scene in the book that will not let you hold it at arm's length, and it is the one that decides everything. A priest in the city has been preaching that the plague is the judgment of God, a punishment the town has earned by its sins. Then he stands beside the doctor at the bed of a child, a small boy, and watches him die of the plague slowly, over hours, in open agony, his body twisting, his cries filling the ward. And there is no sermon that survives that bed. Afterward, the doctor turns on the priest, shaking, and says that this child, at least, was innocent, and that he will refuse to his last breath to love any scheme of things in which children are put to the torture. He does not care whether it is called God's plan. A plan that needs a child to die like that is a plan he will fight, not accept. It is Camus refusing, once and for all, the last and most tempting consolation, the one that whispers the suffering must mean something, that it will be redeemed, that somewhere the books are balanced. He will not take it. The child's death means nothing, and precisely because it means nothing, you fight it with everything you have. I have never been able to read that scene quickly, and I don't think you are meant to. The book was written during the years Camus' own country lay under occupation, while he was in the resistance, editing a secret newspaper by night, and it is impossible not to read the plague as the thing that had come down over Europe. The sealed and frightened town is France under the boot. The volunteers carrying out the dead are the resistance. The one man who quietly prospers, who does not want it to end because the general fear finally makes him feel at home, is the collaborator. And so a sharp objection was made at the time, and has been made ever since, and it deserves its full weight. Evil, the critics said, is not a plague. A plague is a blind and guiltless accident of nature, with no author and no malice and no one to answer for it. But the horror that came over Europe was not a microbe. It was chosen by men out of ideas and carried out by hands that could have refused, and to turn that into a disease is to let the murderers slip away, to change a crime into a kind of weather. It is a serious charge, and I will not pretend it has no force. But Camus had heard it coming, and his reply is folded into the book itself, in the mouth of the man who runs the squads, who says the plague is not only out there in the rats and the air, it is in us. Every one of us carries it. Anyone, given the right words and the right fear, can come to justify a death and join the side of the killers without ever once feeling like one, and the whole moral work of a life is to refuse, over and over, to be a carrier. The plague, in the end, is not only the thing that happens to Oran, it is the thing that can happen inside you. The plague lifts at last, as mysteriously as it came. The gates open, the trains run, the city pours into the streets to celebrate, lovers reunited, the nightmare over. And the doctor, who turns out to have been telling us the story all along, will not join the rejoicing cleanly, because he knows a thing the dancing crowds have chosen to forget. The germ of the plague never dies and never disappears. It lies dormant for years in the furniture and the linen and the cellars, patient, waiting, and one day, for the teaching or the misfortune of men, it will rouse its rats again and send them out to die in a happy and forgetful city. There is no final victory. There is only the work, done again whenever it is needed, by whoever happens to be there to do it. He wrote it all down, he says, so as not to be one of those who stay silent, and to set on record a plain thing he had learned in the middle of the horror, that when the worst arrives, there is more in people to admire than there is to despise. That is not a small thing to carry into the dark with you. Look around the room you are lying in. The fact that it is warm, that clean water waits in the next room, that if you fell ill tonight, there are people a phone call away who would come, that the food in your kitchen crossed 100 hands to reach you. All of it rests on an enormous, invisible web of people you will never meet, doing their jobs, most of them decent, most of the time, holding the world up without being asked and without being thanked. You are right now being kept alive by strangers. Rieu would tell you that is not a sentimental thought, but a simple description. Camus had shown in a story that the answer to a meaningless world is to turn toward each other and do the work. What he had not yet done was prove it, set it in hard argument, and name the exact limit that stays the emperor's hand, and that harder task was still ahead of him. But none of it is ahead of you tonight. Tonight you can simply rest inside the web, held by all those quiet hands, and let it hold you while you sleep. It is 1905 in Moscow, and a young man is standing at the edge of a road with a bomb in his coat. His name is Kalyaev, Kal-i-Ahyev, and he belongs to a small band of revolutionaries who have decided that a certain Grand Duke, an uncle of the Tsar and an architect of the regime's cruelty, must die. Kalyaev is the one chosen to throw the bomb. The carriage comes. He steps forward, his hand closing on the weapon, everything in him ready. And then, in the half-second before he throws, he sees that the Duke is not alone. There are 2 children in the carriage with him, the Duke's young niece and nephew, and Kalyaev, who is willing to kill a tyrant and to hang for it, is not willing to kill those children. He lets the carriage pass. He lowers the bomb. He will wait 2 more days and find the Duke alone and kill him then and go calmly to the gallows for it, because he believes that a man who takes a life must pay with his own, that this is the only thing that keeps a killing from becoming a plain murder. Put yourself on that road for a moment. The bomb is heavy in your coat. The cause you have given your whole life to is finally within reach. The carriage is almost on you, and there at the window are 2 children's faces. Do you throw it? Everything you believe tells you the tyrant must die. Everything you tells you not like this. Kalyaev lived that exact half-second, and he lowered his arm. Hold that image, because the hardest book Camus ever wrote turns on it. He was fascinated by these people, the Russian terrorists of 1905, and he called them the scrupulous assassins, half in love with them, because even in the terrible act of killing, they kept a limit, and they paid the full price themselves, and they never once pretended that what they did was clean. Set them in your memory beside a different kind of killer who was already on his way, the man in the quiet office who would sign the deaths of 1,000 strangers he would never see, feel nothing, and go home to his dinner. Between Kalyaev lowering his bomb and that man signing his forms lies the whole of what Camus set out to understand. He called the book The Rebel, and it was his attempt to do for murder what he had once done for suicide. Years before, he had asked whether the absurd gives a person the right to kill himself, and answered no. Now he asked the larger and more dangerous question, the one the mad emperor had left hanging over everything. Does the absurd give a person the right to kill someone else? If there is no God and no meaning handed down, is anything at all forbidden? And to answer it, he went looking not in the heavens, but in the simplest human gesture he could find. He went looking in the word no. Think of a man who has taken orders his whole life, borne every insult, obeyed every command, and who one day, for no reason he could fully explain, plants his feet and says it. No, not this. You will not do this. In that refusal, Camus saw something extraordinary hiding. Because the instant the man says no, he is also in the same breath saying yes. He is affirming that there is something in him worth defending, a line that must not be crossed, a dignity that is his by right. And here is the turn that changes everything. That dignity is not his alone. When he says, "You may not treat me like this," he means you may not treat anyone like this. The value he suddenly stands on is a shared one. It belongs to all people, or it belongs to none. And so, the man who thought he was utterly alone discovers, in the very act of rebelling, that he is not alone at all. The philosopher Descartes, had once tried to build all certainty on a solitary mind. I think, therefore I am. Camus rewrote it for a world of people who suffer together. I rebel, he said, therefore we are. The no against oppression does not seal you in yourself. It reveals the whole human family standing behind you. And that discovery is the wall. It is the answer to the emperor and his logic, the thing that finally stops the fall. Because if you rebel in the name of human dignity, you cannot then turn and trample human dignity in someone else without betraying the entire ground you are standing on. The very value that gives your no its force is the value that forbids you from becoming an oppressor in your turn. The limit is not handed down from heaven, it grows out of the act of rebellion itself. Kalyaev, lowering the bomb, is not being soft. He is being consistent. He rose up in the name of human life, and so he cannot spend children's lives to do it, or the whole thing collapses into the cruelty it set out to end. But rebellion can forget itself, and this is the dark heart of the book. It happens the moment rebellion stops serving the living person in front of you and starts serving an idea of the future instead. When a movement decides that a perfect world is coming, a paradise at the end of history, and that anyone standing in its way may be swept aside, then it has crossed the very line it was born to defend. It begins to kill people now, real people with real names, for the sake of a happiness that is always just over the horizon and never arrives. Camus watched his own century do exactly this, on a scale the world had never seen. He watched the old dream of liberation curdle into the labor camp and the show trial and the mass grave, watched murder become rational, scheduled, defended in the calm language of science and history and necessity. The scrupulous assassin who lowered his bomb and paid with his life had become the functionary who signs the lists and pays with nothing and calls it progress. And Camus said no to all of it, without a single exception. There is no future paradise, none worth the deliberate murder of one innocent person in the present. The name he gave to the thing that holds rebellion back from that abyss is old and unfashionable. Measure, the Greek idea of the limit, of proportion, of the human scale, set against the monstrous overreach the Greeks called hubris. The rebel, he said, must keep saying both words at once, the no and the yes, and let the yes restrain the no, so that the refusal never swells into a fresh tyranny. He dreamed of what he called the thought of noon, a way of living lit by the Mediterranean sun he had loved as a boy, all clarity and balance and limit, standing against the great cold philosophies of history, marching to its end over whatever it had to crush. It is a loyalty to the actual breathing human being, here and now, over every gleaming idea of what the human being might become tomorrow. And it is desperately hard, because it walks a razor's edge between two betrayals. The betrayal of giving in, of accepting the boot on the neck, and the betrayal of rising up so absolutely that you become the boot yourself. That razor's edge satisfied almost no one, and the sharpest people of his age fell on it, and on him at once. Measure, they said, is a luxury. It is easy to preach clean hands when it is not your neck under the boot. When you are a famous writer in a warm cafe and not a starving worker or a colonized subject with nothing left to lose. History is not made by moderate men keeping their scruples intact. It is made by people willing to get their hands filthy, to do the hard and bloody things that overthrowing a real tyranny actually demands. And a man who refuses all of that violence, who stands above the fight calling for balance, is not neutral at all. He has quietly chosen a side because the oppressor is already committing violence every single day, and to forbid the oppressed from answering it is simply to help the boot stay where it is. Camus' beautiful balance, they said, is a comfortable man's way of feeling pure while other people bleed. I will be honest with you. That objection has a real weight, and I have never been able to set it down completely. I want Camus to be right about this, that you can resist the worst without becoming it, more than I am able to prove that he is. He knew the objection was coming, and he had no knockdown answer to it, only a conviction he would not surrender, that the means you use become the world you build, that if you murder your way toward paradise, you arrive in a country made of murder, and that a victory won by torturing the innocent is never the victory the rebellion wanted. Whether that is the deepest wisdom of the century or the naivety of a man who never had to choose in the real dark, I cannot tell you for certain, and neither, in the end, could he. What I can tell you is that holding this line, refusing to bless the killings of his own side, was about to cost him the closest friendship of his life. But that reckoning belongs to another hour. For now, notice the small and enormous thing his whole difficult argument was built to protect. It was not an idea. It was a body. It was the actual, particular, breathing human creature, the one that can be hurt, the one that dies only once and can never be replaced by any future. It was, if you follow the argument all the way down, exactly the body you are lying in right now, warm under the covers, rising and falling with your breath, worth more than any theory of tomorrow, not to be spent for any paradise, not by anyone, ever. That was the whole of what he was defending, against the emperor and against the ideologues alike. You, here, now, alive. Let that be enough to rest on. No idea in the world is worth what you are, and tonight you do not have to defend it against a thing. You have only to lie here and be it, and breathe, and let the argument go quiet and sleep. For a few years after the war, the two most famous minds in Europe were friends, and you could find them most nights in the same handful of cafes on the left bank of Paris, talking until the chairs were stacked on the tables around them. One was Camus, the handsome one, the outsider come up from Algeria, the hero of the resistance press, the man whose face was already turning into a poster. The other was Jean-Paul Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, small, wall-eyed, spectacularly ugly, and quite possibly the most powerful philosopher alive, the author of vast and difficult systems and the uncrowned king of post-war French thought. They had met during the occupation and taken to each other at once, and now they drank together and argued half the night, and went to the same parties, and were spoken of in the same breath, filed under the fashionable word of the moment, existentialism, a label Camus disliked and kept trying to shrug off. They were not the same kind of man at all. Camus had come from nothing and never quite forgot it. Sartre had come from the comfortable middle and never quite noticed it. But for a while the friendship was real, one of the real ones, the kind you assume will simply always be there. Underneath it, though, a crack was widening, and it ran along the deepest fault line of the century. Sartre was moving steadily toward the revolution. He had come to believe that a serious person, faced with the misery of the world, had to throw in with the one great force that promised to end it, which in that era meant the communists, and that to keep a fastidious distance from them tut-tutting about their methods was to betray the poor whose only real hope they were. Camus was moving the other way. He had been a communist himself, briefly, as a young man in Algiers, and had left. He had looked hard at what was actually happening in the Soviet Union, the camps, the millions worked to death behind the fine words, and had decided that no future, however golden, could be worth that. And the Cold War was hardening around them both, demanding that every thinking person in Europe pick a side, Moscow or Washington, and Camus would not. He thought both sides were building their paradise on corpses. Refusing to choose satisfied no one and made him, slowly, a man alone. Then he published the book that argued no dream of tomorrow can justify the murder of an innocent today, and that the revolution his friend was defending had betrayed itself in exactly the way the old tyrannies had. To Sartre's circle, it read as treason. They came for him in print, and they did it in the cruelest way available. Sartre did not even review the book himself. He handed it to a younger man in his circle who took it apart with open contempt, dismissing Camus as a lightweight, a pretty stylist playing at philosophy, a bourgeois moralist hiding from the hard facts of history behind a lot of beautiful empty words about limits and measure. Camus, wounded to the core and far too proud to show it gracefully, wrote a long reply and made it worse by aiming it not at the young reviewer at all, but coldly over his head, at the editor himself, at Sartre, refusing even to dignify the underling with a direct answer. And so Sartre answered him, personally, and it was one of the most brilliant and merciless things he ever wrote. He mocked Camus' wounded vanity, his solemn self-importance, his habit of handing down moral lessons from on high as though he had become a portable statue of justice. He sneered at his philosophy. And then he found the softest place and pressed, "You were poor once," he as good as said, "but you are not poor now. You have grown comfortable and famous and frightened of the real struggle, and you have abandoned the very people you came from, all so that you can keep your own hands clean and your own conscience smooth." It ran in the most read journal in France. All of intellectual Paris devoured it, and most of them decided Sartre had won. The friendship was over, completely and for good. They never spoke again. Now here is where I have to do the hardest thing this whole piece asks of me, which is to stand in the middle and give both of them their full due, because both of them were right and both of them were wrong, and I cannot honestly hand you a winner. Camus was right that the camps were real, that the left he was quarrelling with was making shameful excuses for mass murder, that a great many elegant Parisian intellectuals were prepared to look away from an ocean of Soviet dead because the killers happened to wear the right colours. He was right that you cannot build a just world with the tools of injustice, that the means become the ends, that a revolution which starts shooting the innocent has already lost whatever it was for. History has been kind to that half of the argument. The paradise the communists promised never arrived, and the mountain of the dead they left behind was every bit as high as he had said it would be. But Sartre was not simply a monster in a cafe, and his blow landed because part of it was true. It is a real thing, and not a cheap one, to point out that a man who condemns all violence from a position of perfect safety has quietly made his peace with the violence already happening. The oppressed do not get to keep clean hands. That option is only available to people who are not being crushed. And Camus, for all his origins, was now a celebrated writer in Paris, and there was something in his lofty refusal to get down into the actual dirty fights of his time that could look, from the outside, less like integrity than like an unusually elegant way of staying out of trouble. That very charge would come back to haunt him on the one subject that cut closest to his own heart, and there it would not be nearly so easy to answer. You have stood, in your own smaller way, somewhere on that same ground. Anyone who has ever ended a friendship over a matter of principle knows the particular grief of it, the way you can be entirely certain you are right and still lie awake, mourning the person you lost by being right. And anyone who has ever had to choose between keeping their hands clean and actually changing something knows it is not a choice between good and evil, but between two goods that will not fit in the same pair of hands, and that, whichever you take, you will lie awake over the other. These two men simply lived that ordinary human agony on the largest stage there was, in front of everyone, in print, permanently. And there is a last thing, the thing that actually undoes me whenever I come back to this story. Years later, when Camus was killed, suddenly, in an accident on a winter road, the first person to write about him with real tenderness was Sartre. The man who had destroyed him in public sat down and mourned him without reservation. He wrote that their quarrel had been nothing more than another way of living alongside one another without ever losing sight of each other, that Camus had gone on living all that time in a corner of his life, and that he could not stop thinking of him. The enmity had been loud and public, the grief was quiet and private, and both of them were completely true. Two men who could not agree about the one thing that mattered most to either of them, who never took a word of it back, and one of whom wept when the other died on the road. That is not a footnote to the ideas. That is the human fact the ideas had been riding on the whole time. So I will not pretend to referee the dead. The question they broke on, whether the future can ever be worth a killing in the present, whether you can stay good with clean hands, or must dirty them to be any use at all, is not a thing two of the sharpest minds of the century could settle between them, and it is certainly not one you have to settle here, in the dark, before you sleep. Let it be unfinished. Let both of them be right. In the way the hardest questions, let everyone be a little right and no one be right enough, and let them rest, the ugly brilliant one and the handsome haunted one, wherever the dead go to stop arguing. The wound Sartre tore in Camus that summer did not close. It went down into him and came back up not long after as the strangest and most bitter book he ever wrote, a confession spoken by a man in a bar who has decided that no one, himself least of all, is innocent. But that voice can wait for the light. For now there is nothing to judge and no one to answer, only the quiet and your own slow breath, and the permission to let it all stay unresolved until morning. The book has no sun in it anywhere. That is the first thing you notice, coming to it from everything else Camus wrote. He set it as far as he could get from the blue coast of his childhood, in Amsterdam, in the fog, in the endless grey, where the canals coil around the old city in rings, like the circles of some flat and sunken hell, and the rain never quite stops, and a man can go for days without seeing his own shadow because there is no light strong enough to throw one. In a sailor's bar in that city, a stranger falls into conversation with you. He is charming, cultivated, a little too eager, and he will not let you go. He buys you a drink, and then another, and he begins to talk, and over the next 5 days, in the bar and along the canals, and out on the flat grey water, he tells you the whole story of his life, and you never once get to answer, because the entire book is his voice, and yours is only imagined, a silence he talks into. His name, he says, is Jean-Baptiste Clamence, Clam-Mahan-Esses, though you suspect that is not quite his name, and by the end you will suspect a great deal more than that. In Paris, he tells you, he had been a great man, a celebrated defence lawyer, handsome, eloquent, generous, forever taking the side of widows and orphans and the poor, giving alms, guiding the blind across the street, beloved by everyone who knew him. He lived, by his own account, on a kind of summit, in a cloudless good conscience, warmly and thoroughly satisfied with his own goodness. He was one of those people who seem to have gotten life right, who do the decent thing and are admired for it and go home pleased, and he loved it. That is the detail he keeps returning to. He loved being good, loved being seen to be good, loved the warm bath of his own virtue. And then, one night, on a bridge over the river, the whole edifice came down. He had just passed a young woman leaning alone on the railing and had walked on, and a little way behind him he heard the sound of a body striking the water and a cry repeated, carrying downstream, and then silence. He did not turn around. He did not run back or call out or go in after her. He stood still for a moment, and then he walked on, and he told no one, and he did his best never to think of it again. For years it worked, and then, crossing another bridge one evening, he heard laughter behind him, ordinary laughter, and turned and found no one there, and the sound would not leave him, and through that little crack the whole truth came flooding in. The generosity had been vanity. The noble causes had been self-love. The good man on his summit had heard a human being drowning a few steps away and kept walking rather than spoil his evening. And everything since had been an elaborate performance, staged for an audience of one, himself. The good conscience did not survive the discovery. It fell. Here the book becomes something stranger than a confession, because Camus cannot bear to be judged for what he has seen in himself, and yet he lives in a world where God is gone, and there is no one left to forgive him. So he invents a way out, an ingenious and terrible one. If he cannot be innocent, and cannot be absolved, he will confess. He will confess everything, loudly, to strangers in bars, painting himself as low and false and guilty as he possibly can. But the confession is a trap, and you are standing inside it. Because the portrait he paints of himself, the vain man in love with his own goodness, the coward who walked on, is really a portrait of everyone, of you. And once he has held that mirror up, and you have flinched at your own face in it, he has won. Having debased himself completely, he has earned, he thinks, the right to judge you completely from a brand new height built out of his own shame. The more I accuse myself, he says, the more I have the right to judge you. He calls himself a Judge-Penitent, and he has found a way to climb back onto the summit of his own superiority by the one road still open in a fallen world. Not by being innocent, which is impossible, but by being the man who names everyone's guilt, beginning with his own. It is a diabolically clever machine, and it is aimed straight at the person listening, which is to say at you, in your chair, in the dark. Because you know that summit. You have stood on it. You know the quiet pleasure of having done the kind thing, and the way a small part of you was watching yourself do it, and approving. You know the causes you take up partly for how they let you feel about yourself. You know, if you are honest, the moment you crossed the street to avoid the person who needed something, the message you left unanswered, the trouble you decided was not yours, the small, clean walking on. Camus is not describing a monster. He is describing the ordinary architecture of a decent life, the vanity folded invisibly inside the virtue, and the longer he talks, the harder it becomes to feel superior to him, which is exactly the effect he is after. And you have to ask why Camus, of all people, would write this. Remember where he was when he did. He had just been torn apart in public and told by the sharpest man in Paris that he had become a self-satisfied statue of justice, handing down lessons from a pedestal, a moralist grown comfortable and false. Most wounded men answer a charge like that by defending themselves. Camus did the opposite and far braver thing. He wrote a whole book about a self-satisfied statue of justice whose virtue turns out to be vanity all the way down, and he built it partly out of himself. Camus is Camus' enemies, the smug judges of the age, held up and skewered. But Camus is also Camus, the admired public man privately unsure whether any of his famous goodness was ever real. The sunniest writer of his generation turned all his lucidity, for once, not on the silent universe, but on the rot inside his own virtue, and made the most corrosive, sunless thing he ever wrote. Whether that was an act of great honesty or an act of great self-pity is a question the book refuses to settle, and honest readers have split on it ever since. You can read The Fall as the deepest thing Camus ever wrote, a fearless unmasking of the vanity hidden inside all human goodness, the work of a man brave enough to indict himself alongside everyone else. Or you can read it as the sound of a hurt man nursing his wounds, because look at what Clemence's confession actually accomplishes. It ends by declaring that no one is innocent, that all are guilty, which is exactly what a man who has just been condemned would most want to be true. If we are all guilty, then no one ever had the standing to judge Camus, and the grand confession is only the most sophisticated self-defense ever composed, revenge dressed as repentance. And the maddening genius of it is that you cannot tell which it is, because Clemence is the most unreliable voice imaginable, made that way on purpose, so that the confession and the manipulation are the very same words, and you will never pull them apart. I will admit this is the book of his that most makes me squirm, because every time I settle in to judge Clemence, I catch myself doing the exact thing he does, and I am not sure I come out of it any cleaner than he does. What the book leaves in your hands, in the end, is a genuinely bleak modern truth. Once you stop believing in any final court, any God who will one day weigh you and, whatever the verdict, at least settle the matter, the hunger to be judged and forgiven does not disappear. It simply has nowhere to go. So we judge one another instead, endlessly, on our screens and in our own heads and across our dinner tables, and no one is ever acquitted because there is no one left with the authority to strike the gavel and say, "It is finished, you may go. Do not wait for the last judgment," Clemence tells you with a thin smile. It takes place every day. And the strange, sad thing is that The Fall let Camus confess every guilt but one. There was a real guilt back home that no invented voice in a bar could ever carry for him, and on that one, when it came, he would not be able to speak at all. But none of that is tonight. That is the one mercy the hour holds out to you. The court that sits in your head, the one that spends the daylight convicting you of your failures and, when it tires of that, convicting everyone else of theirs, is allowed to adjourn now. You do not have to judge yourself before you sleep, and you do not have to judge anyone else either, and you certainly do not have to answer for the woman on the bridge, or the message you never sent, or any of the small, clean walking on of an ordinary life. Let the gavel lie where it fell. Let the endless trial go quiet. Whatever you are guilty of, and whatever you are not, none of it is being decided tonight, and Clemence and his mirror can keep until morning. For now there is no case to answer, no summit to defend, and no one at all watching you be good. There is only the dark, which judges nothing and asks nothing and lets you rest. It should have been the happiest week of his life. In December of 1957, in Stockholm, the poor boy from Belcourt stood at the summit of the whole literary world and was handed the Nobel Prize, the highest honour his art could give him, at 44, one of the youngest ever to receive it. And a few days after the ceremony, at a meeting with students, a young Algerian rose in the audience and asked him, in front of everyone, why he was so silent about Algeria. Why the great champion of justice, who signed petitions for the oppressed of half the world, had nothing to say about the war tearing apart his own homeland, and would not stand with the Algerians fighting for their freedom. The room went quiet and waited. Camus tried to answer, and in the answer he said the sentence that has trailed him ever since, almost always in a form that betrays it. He said that he had always condemned terror, and that he had to condemn just as firmly a terror being practiced blindly in the streets of Algiers, on the tramways, where, right then, bombs were being thrown. His mother, he said, might be on one of those tramways, and if that was what justice meant, then he preferred his mother. That last line got loose in the world, and the world flattened it into a slogan. Between justice and my mother, I choose my mother. Put that way, it sounds monstrous, a man setting his own family above the freedom of a whole people, but that is not what he said, and the difference is everything. He was not weighing his mother against justice in the abstract. He was refusing one particular thing that called itself justice, a justice that expressed itself by planting a bomb on a crowded tram and killing whoever happened to be riding it, an old deaf woman on her way home included. He was saying that no cause, however right, earns the right to murder the civilians it finds in its way. It was, in fact, the exact principle he had held his whole life. It simply happened, this time, to have his own mother's face on it. To feel the full weight of it, you have to remember who he was. Camus was a pied noir, one of the European settlers, born and raised on Algerian soil, poor as dirt, a child of that white sunlit coast far more than of France, which he barely knew until he was grown. Algeria was not a colony to him. It was home. It was the sea and the light that had made him and his mother, the nearly deaf and nearly silent woman we began with, was still living in the same poor quarter of Algiers where he had grown up. And here is the thing his enemies preferred to forget. As a young journalist, long before any of the fame, Camus had gone up into the mountains of Kabylia, the wretched Berber highlands, and written a series of reports on the famine there, so unsparing, so full of rage at the starvation and the injustice the colonial system was inflicting on the native people, that it helped get him run out of the country. He was no comfortable colonist averting his eyes. He had seen the misery of the Arabs and the Berbers with his own eyes and named it, early, at real cost. He loved that country, and by now he loved and grieved for both of the peoples tearing it in half, which is exactly why he could not do the one thing everyone demanded, which was to choose a side. The war that began in 1954 was savage from every direction. The independence fighters set off bombs in cafes and on trams, killing civilians, European and Arab alike, anyone who might be called a collaborator. The French answered with mass reprisals, with torture made routine, with a machinery of repression Camus found every bit as unforgivable. He would not bless the terror because it murdered the innocent, his own mother among the possible dead. And he would not bless the torture and the repression either, for exactly the same reason. Stand in his place for a moment. You belong to one of the two peoples of a country you love more than your own life. You can see the real wound in both of them. The war is on, and every side you could possibly take would betray someone you cannot stop loving. What he wanted was the thing that was quietly becoming impossible. An Algeria reformed and shared, where the Arab majority finally had full justice and equal rights, and where the million poor Europeans like his own family, who had known no other home, were not driven into the sea. He wanted both peoples to live, and in a war, wanting both sides to live is not a position anyone will let you keep. He tried once to make it real. Early in 1956, he went back to Algiers and stood up in public and begged both sides for the smallest, most desperate thing he could imagine, a truce for civilians. Not a political settlement, just an agreement to stop killing the ones who were not fighting, whatever else the two sides did to each other. It was a brave and almost naive act, and it failed completely. European hardliners gathered outside and howled for his death while he spoke. The fighters had their own plans. Nothing came of it, and something in him seems to have closed after that. He had offered the only thing he had, and it had been trampled by everyone, and from then on he mostly fell silent in public about the country he loved most in the world. That silence is the thing he is most often condemned for, and you will have your own quiet version of it somewhere in your life. Anyone who has watched a family or a community or a whole country come apart into two furious halves knows the trap of it. Both sides certain, both sides demanding you declare yourself, and you love people on both sides. You can see the real wound on both sides, so every word you might say would betray someone you love, until at last you simply stop speaking, and everyone reads your silence as the worst kind of cowardice. That is roughly where Camus ended up, on the largest and most public scale imaginable. And I want to give both verdicts on it their full and fair weight, because this is the hardest thing anyone ever asked of him, and I do not fully trust anyone, myself included, who finds it easy. Against him, the charge is serious, and it has largely won the argument of history. Here was the great moral voice of the age, and on the defining injustice of his own life, the colonization of his own country, he could not bring himself to stand with the colonized in their demand to be free. He treated the terror of the powerless and the torture of the powerful as though they weighed the same, when one was the violence of a boot and the other the violence of the people beneath it. He worried in the end more about the fate of his own European community than about the ending of a system that had ground down the Arab majority for over a century. And a man who will not, when it finally counts, say plainly that a colonized people has the right to its freedom has, whatever his intentions, quietly taken the side of the colonizer. That was Sartre's charge from years before. Come home at last to the one place it fit exactly, and a great deal of the world has agreed with it ever since. The case in his defense is just as serious, though, and I will not let it be waved away. He was one of the very few who refused, from first to last, to pretend that murdering civilians becomes acceptable when the cause is good. He had defended the Arabs when it was dangerous and unfashionable, and long before it was easy. He had risked himself to try to spare the lives of non-combatants on both sides, and when that failed, he went on quietly, without publicity, interceding to save individual men condemned to death, Arab and European both, more lives than his loud accusers ever saved with their manifestos. And he saw, more clearly than the intellectuals cheering the revolution from the cafes of Paris, exactly how it would end, in atrocity and in the flight of a whole people, and in a new power that would not be gentle. In much of that, he was simply right. His refusal to make grand declarations was not the failure of his principles. It may have been the last and most costly application of them, the refusal to hand over one single real breathing person on any side to the beautiful abstraction of history. I cannot resolve that for you, and I have stopped trying to resolve it for myself. It is so easy from a safe distance and 60 years on to know precisely what Camus should have said, and I have learned to distrust how easy it is, because the ease is a luxury he was never granted. He was standing inside the fire, and everyone he loved was in it with him. And here is what I keep returning to, underneath all the politics. At the very center of the whole impossible thing, behind the word justice and the slogans and the war, there was one actual woman, poor, nearly deaf, nearly wordless, sitting in a small apartment in a poor part of Algiers, the woman he had loved without being able to speak to her since he was a boy. And Camus' entire unforgivable failure, if that is what it was, came down to this, that he could never once stop seeing her. He could not turn her into a statistic or an acceptable cost or a necessary sacrifice for a better tomorrow. When the word justice was spoken, he saw her face on that tram, and he could not make himself agree to her death for anything on earth. He died in 1960, before the war ended, and never saw independence come. And when it came, 2 years later, the poor Europeans fled almost exactly as he had feared, and his mother had died only months after he did, in a city that was no longer going to be theirs. History gave him no clean verdict and no happy ending, and it never closed his wound. There was one more failure in him, deeper than any argument about the war, and it ran right down into his imagination, into the very stories that had made him. But that is for another hour, and it will keep. For now, look around the room you are lying in and notice that it is quiet and that no one is in it demanding you choose a side. The great arguments will still be raging in the morning. The world will still be tearing at itself and asking you to pick. But not here and not now. Tonight you are allowed to do the thing Camus was never allowed to do in peace, to set the abstractions down and hold instead the actual particular people you love, the real faces, the ones you would never trade for any idea in the world, and to keep them close and rest. Go back to the beach, to the white sand and the blinding light, and the man lying dead at the water's edge, and this time do not look at Meursault. Look at the other one. Look at the man who was shot once and then 4 more times, and bled into the sand under that enormous sun. What was his name? The book does not tell you. It never tells you from the first page to the last, because it does not know and does not think to ask. Through the whole of The Stranger, one of the most read and most admired novels ever written, the murdered man has no name. He is called only the Arab. He has no history, no home we are shown, no mother whose grief we hear, no words of his own. He is a presence on a beach, a knife flash in the heat, an occasion for a Frenchman's reckoning with the universe. A man is killed. An entire novel unfolds out of his death. The killer's soul is examined down to its depths across 200 pages, and the dead man is never once granted the 2 syllables of a name. And this is stranger than it first appears, because of the title itself. The book is called The Stranger, or in some translations The Outsider, and everyone has always taken the outsider to be Meursault, the cool, honest European who will not play society's games. But look at the world the book is set in. It is colonial Algeria, and the true outsider in that country, the real stranger in his own land, is not the French clerk at all. It is the Arab, the dispossessed native, watched and policed and made a foreigner on soil his people had lived on for 1,000 years. The philosopher of The Outsider wrote a masterpiece about outsiders and could not see the actual outsider standing in the middle of his own story. The Europeans in the novel all have names and histories and inner lives. The Arabs are a silent, watchful, faceless presence at the edges, following, waiting, dying. The whole hierarchy of the colony is reproduced exactly in the architecture of the book, and the author never seems to notice he has done it. I have to tell you something uncomfortable here, which is that I read The Stranger many times before it ever once occurred to me to wonder what the dead man was called. It simply never came up. The absence did not register as an absence, and that, it turns out, is precisely how the thing works. You do not notice the missing name, because the missing name is the water you have been swimming in your whole life, the quiet arrangement by which some people are the subjects of the story and others are only the scenery. My own not noticing, after all those readings, is the most unsettling proof I know of how deep it runs. Half a century later, a great critic finally said it plainly. Edward Said, Saed, the Palestinian scholar, in a book on culture and empire, read Camus's fiction as saturated all the way through, with the colonial world it pretends merely to take for granted, a landscape where the French are simply at home and the Arabs are shadows, a humane and beautiful body of work that quietly assumes French Algeria as the natural order of things. Said was not calling Camus a bigot. His point was subtler and more disturbing than that. It was that empire can run so deep that it shapes the imagination of even the most decent and honest artist so completely that the artist cannot feel it happening, cannot see the person he has erased. That is not an insult thrown at a dead man. It is an X-ray of how power gets inside the mind. And then, in our own century, something beautiful happened. An Algerian writer named Kamel Daoudi, a man who loves Camus, who writes in Camus' own shadow and knows his books by heart, sat down and wrote the answer. He gave the dead man his story back. His novel is narrated by the murdered man's younger brother, an old man now, talking in a bar in Oran, telling everything the famous book left out. The family that was destroyed, the mother who waited the rest of her life for a body that was never returned, the 60 years of grief behind a killing the world remembered only as a European's philosophical crisis. And most of all, he gives him his name. He was called Musa. He was a real man with a body and a brother and a mother, and he was called Musa, and your beautiful book could not even be troubled to write it down. The man with no name, after 70 years, finally has one. Now, there is a defense of Camus here, and it is not a cheap one, and it deserves its full hearing. The Stranger was written in 1942 in a colonial world by a man formed entirely inside it. Is it just to drag a book from one age before the court of another, and convict it of failing to know what it could not yet know? Almost every great work of the past carries a blindness that its own time could not see. If we start disqualifying the masterpieces for not sharing our politics, we will empty the whole library. Camus was not uniquely blind, and as we have seen, in his actual life he cared about the suffering of the Arabs more, and earlier, and at more personal cost, than nearly any of his peers. To hold the Stranger up and condemn it for the sins of its century can look like the easiest and most self-congratulating judgment there is. That defense is real, and I will not knock it down, but I will not let it close the case either, because it does not go all the way. For one thing, Camus himself, in his journalism, had looked straight at Arab human beings and seen them whole, in their hunger and their dignity, so the blindness in the novel was not beyond his century or beyond his own mind, which makes it harder to explain away, not easier. For another, the point of the criticism was never really to scold a man. It was to notice a structure, and noticing a true structure is not arrogance, it is sight. And there is the plain fact that the erased man is not some minor figure at the margins. He is the victim. He is the person whose death the entire book is built upon, and the book's complete incuriosity about him repeats precisely the logic of the colony itself. A European life is a whole interior world, and an Arab death is a plot point. And finally, the person who has insisted most fiercely that this matters is not some distant judge with an agenda. It is Daoud, an Algerian, Camus's own devoted heir, speaking for the descendants of the man who was never named. So the defense has weight, and the charge has weight, and they do not cancel each other out. Both things are simply true at once. The Stranger is a masterpiece, and it disappears a human being. And I am not going to hand you a clean way out of that, because there isn't one, and the honest thing is to sit inside the discomfort of it, rather than reach for the nearest exit. The reason all of this presses past a literary argument and reaches into you is that you already know its shape from both sides. You have been somewhere, the one no one named, the category instead of the person, the demographic, the extra in the background of a story that was about someone else. And you have also done the naming and the not naming yourself every single day, because the news hands you deaths by the dozen from far-off places, nameless, a number and a map, while one death close to your own life has a name and a face and a whole world that ends with it. That gap between whose death is a story and whose death is a statistic did not close when the French Empire fell. It is running right now, tonight, through your own attention. And the small, radical act that Daoud performed, the one still open to any of us, is simply to stop at the number and ask what the person was called. I am not going to tie this off neatly, because it does not tie off. How you hold a beautiful thing that also did a harm, how you love a man and still name his blindness, is not a knot you have to untie before you sleep, and it will still be there, exactly as tangled and exactly as important in the morning. But you can carry one clear thing out of it into the dark, and it is a gentle one. A name can be given back. The uncounted can be counted, even 70 years late, even by a stranger who simply refused to let the silence stand. Whoever the world has turned into a number, someone still knows their name and grieves them as a whole world. And you, lying here tonight, are no one's category and no one's scenery. You are a particular person with a name held in the minds of the people who love you, irreplaceable. Camus never got to answer any of this, as it happens. He was still tangled in the whole of it, still working, still unfinished, when his own story stopped without warning on a wet road on an ordinary winter afternoon. But that belongs to the last of our hours together. For now, let the hard question rest where it lies, and let yourself rest too. Before the wet road and the tree, there was the highest afternoon of his life. In the autumn of 1957, the boy from the 2 rented rooms in Belcourt, the son of the deaf cleaning woman, the child who had grown up in a home without a single book, was given the Nobel Prize for Literature, the greatest honour the world of letters can bestow, at 44, one of the youngest ever to receive it. Try to hold the whole distance of that in your mind for a moment, from the poverty and the silence and the borrowed light of that apartment to the top of the entire literary world, the whole arc of a life that by any ordinary reckoning should never have left the slum. He had every right to stand at the top of his whole life and simply savour it. And the first thing he did, once the noise had died down a little after his thoughts had gone to his mother, was to sit down and write a letter to a retired schoolteacher in Algiers. To Louis Germain, the man from the very beginning of all this, the one who had spotted the poor bright child, argued with his grandmother, coached him for free, and pried open the door out of the warehouse and toward everything that followed. Camus wrote to him, in words I can only give you a piece of. "I have waited," he said, "for the commotion around me to settle before speaking to you a little from the heart. I have just been given far too great an honour, one I neither sought nor asked for. But when I heard the news, my first thought after my mother was of you. Without you, without the affectionate hand you held out to the small poor child that I was, without your teaching and your example, none of this would ever have happened." And he signed it by telling the old man that he was, and would always remain, his grateful pupil, and that he embraced him with all his heart. The most celebrated writer alive, standing at the top of his life, and the first thing he wanted to do with it was to turn all the way back around to the person who had lifted him onto the first step and say thank you. If you want to know what kind of man was inside all the philosophy, it is there, in that letter, more than anywhere else. The summit was not simple, though. He was uneasy with the prize, felt he was too young for it, felt in his darker moods that it was a kind of headstone laid over a life he did not think was finished, a crowning that arrives at the end while his best work still felt ahead of him. And it came in the middle of the Algerian agony that was tearing at him, and the loneliness that had closed around him since the break with his oldest friends. He took the money the prize brought and bought a quiet house in a village in the south of France, a place to be still and to write, and there, in the stillness, he began the book he believed would finally be the real one. He did not get to finish it. On the 4th of January, 1960, he was travelling back to Paris from that house in the south. He had a train ticket in his pocket. The plan had been to go home by rail with his family. But his friend and publisher, Michel Gallimard, was driving up to Paris in his car, a fast and beautiful machine called a Facel Vega, and offered him a place in it. And Camus, at the last moment, changed his mind and got in. On a long, straight, empty stretch of wet road near a village called Villeblevin, the car, for reasons no one was ever fully able to settle, a burst tire perhaps, or the wet surface, or the speed, left the road and struck a plane tree at the side of it. Camus was killed at once. He was 46 years old. And when they went through what was left, they found, still in his coat, the train ticket he never used. "It is that ticket I cannot get past." Everything else about the death is terrible in the ordinary way that sudden death is terrible, but the ticket turns it into something else, something that feels almost like a cruel joke told by the universe itself. Because it means the whole thing hung on nothing, on a small, ordinary choice made on an ordinary afternoon, car or train, this door or that one, the kind of choice you make a dozen times a day without a thought. Take the train, as he had meant to, and there are perhaps 30 more years, more books, the answers he never lived to give the people still arguing about him. Take the car, and there is a tree. A whole enormous life, and everything it might yet have become, turning on a coin no one even knew they were flipping. And you should feel the small cold draft of that on the back of your own neck, because your life is threaded through with the same coins. You are lying here, breathing tonight, at the end of a long chain of ordinary choices and near misses that could each have gone the other way, roads not taken that would have ended you, afternoons that could have been the last one, and simply, for no reason you will ever know, were not. The arbitrariness that Camus spent his life describing was never really a theory about the cosmos. It is the plain, unremarkable condition of every hour you are given, running quietly underneath your whole life, mostly unnoticed, until a ticket in a dead man's pocket makes you feel it. Which brings us to the hardest question the death asks, and people have turned it over ever since. Does it make a mockery of him? There is a version of the thought that is almost unbearable. The man who spent his whole life teaching us how to be happy inside a meaningless universe, struck down meaninglessly at the height of his powers, cut off mid-sentence, his real book unfinished in the mud, as though the void he had described so beautifully had simply reached out and swatted him to prove that all his talk of scorn and revolt and imagining Sisyphus happy could not buy him one extra mile of that road. Read that way, the crash is the absurd having the last laugh at the philosopher of the absurd. But turn it once more, and it becomes nearly the opposite. Because this death is not a refutation of anything he said. It is the exact thing he said, made flesh. He had told us, from the very beginning, that the universe is silent and indifferent, that death comes without reason and without warning, to the great and the small alike, at any moment, and that no meaning is on its way to make the arithmetic balance. He never once promised that his philosophy would spare him or spare you. He promised the opposite. So the crash did not disprove the absurd. It demonstrated it, one final, brutal time. And here is what matters most. His philosophy was never about avoiding the absurd death. It was about how to live in its shadow. Imagine Sisyphus happy was never a guarantee that Sisyphus would not die. It was a claim about the quality of the living, right up until he does. The tree took the ending, which was never in his hands or anyone's. It could not touch the answer, which was the life itself, lived fully in the sun, argued and loved and refused and revolted, all the way to an ordinary winter afternoon. The universe kept its old promise to him, and so, in his own way, right to the end, did he. So perhaps it is both, and he would have insisted on the second half. It feels like a mockery, and it is, in fact, a confirmation, and the man himself would have told you not to flinch from either. He got the death he had always known was possible, the one he had described more clearly than almost anyone alive. And before it came, he had done the only thing that was ever actually up to him, which was to have been thoroughly, stubbornly, gratefully alive. In the wreckage of the car, in the mud, they found the pages he had been writing at the house in the south, the unfinished book, the one he thought would be his best. And it was not, in the end, about the absurd or revolt or any of the great ideas that had made him famous. It was about a poor boy and a silent mother and a father he never knew. He had been travelling all that time, all the way back to the beginning. But that book and that beginning belong to the last and quietest of our hours, the one we are almost inside of now. For this one, let it be enough to lay the whole life down where it came to rest. The prize is given, the letter is written and received, the road is behind us, the tree is behind us. There is nothing left to decide about him now, and nothing left to defend. His story is complete, the way yours is not yet, and there is a strange peace in a finished story, even one that ended too soon, on the wrong road, by the flip of a coin no one saw. Let it settle, let him settle, and let yourself sink down one more notch into the dark toward the last thing, which is the softest thing, and which is nearly here. They pulled the pages out of the mud, in the wreckage by the road, in the ruined car and scattered across the wet grass, along with the ordinary luggage of a man who had expected to arrive somewhere, were 140-odd handwritten pages, stained and torn, the manuscript he had been bent over all that autumn in the house in the south. It was unfinished, breaking off in mid-thought the way his life had. And then, strangely, it disappeared into a drawer for more than 30 years. His family could not bear to bring it out, or the world was not ready, or grief simply kept it locked away, and it was not until 1994, 34 years after the crash, that his daughter finally deciphered the difficult handwriting and gave the book to the world. So the last thing Camus ever wrote reached us as a kind of message in a bottle from before the tree, an unfinished voice arriving decades late, still somehow warm. And here is what it was about. Not the absurd, not revolt, not the silence of the universe, not any of the great cold ideas that had made him the most famous thinker of his age. It was about a poor boy in a bright, bookless apartment in Algiers. It was about a nearly deaf mother who could not read and did not speak much and loved her son past all saying. It was about the sun on the sea and the games in the street and the terrible tenderness of a childhood with nothing in it but light. At the end of his life, at the summit of everything, the man had turned all the way around and walked back, in the only way a writer can, to the very beginning, to the house of silence where we started, all those hours ago. And he was writing it in a way he had never let himself write before. His earlier books had been spare and cold and ironic, every sentence held out at arm's length and controlled to the last comma. This one poured. It was warm and full and overflowing, a big, generous novel of a kind he had never once attempted, as though at the end he had finally stopped guarding himself and simply let the love come up out of him. He put the sun in it, and the sea, and the games in the poor streets. He put the school teacher in it too, the one who had reached into a bookless life and pulled the boy out, the man he had thanked in that letter from the summit. The last book Camus ever wrote is crowded with the people who had made him, set down at last with open hands. There is a scene in it I cannot get out of my mind. The man, grown, famous, middle-aged, goes to find his father's grave, the father who died in the war before the boy was old enough to keep a single memory of his face. He stands in front of the stone and does the small arithmetic we all do at gravesides, the dates, the subtraction, and he realizes with a kind of vertigo that his father had died at 29, that he himself, standing there, is now past 40, that he has become older than his own father ever got to be, that the man under the stone is, in the strangest possible sense, now younger than his son. And something breaks open in him, some grief he had carried, unopened his whole life for a man he never knew, and he understands that he has spent all his years being, in a way, a man without a past, a boy who had to invent himself out of nothing, with no father to hand him a name or a place or a story. The first man, a person starting the whole human race over from the beginning, alone, in the light, with no inheritance but the sun. He had planned years before to write his life's work in 3 great movements. The first was the absurd, the silence, Sisyphus and his stone, and he had finished that. The second was revolt, The Rebel and the Plague and the Limit that holds back the fall, and he had finished that too and been half destroyed for it. And the third, still ahead of him, was to be about love. Not romantic love, but the deeper thing, the love of the world and of people and of the ordinary sacred life, the yes made whole at last. This book was to be the opening of that third movement, the book of love, the one that came home. He died in the middle of writing it. The absurd, in the end, got the last word, exactly as he had always said it might. But you should notice, tonight, what the last word he was reaching for actually was. He died with his hand stretched out toward love. And there is a line on the very first leaf of the manuscript that I have never been able to read without stopping. The book, the great tender book about his mother, he had dedicated to her. And the dedication reads, "To you, who will never be able to read this book." He wrote his most loving book for the one person on earth who could not read a word of it. The deaf, near-silent mother from the beginning of the whole story, whom he had loved his entire life across a gap that no sentence could ever close, and here he was, at the end, writing 300 pages of love straight into that silence, knowing she would never read one line, and doing it anyway. If you have understood nothing else about this man across all these hours, understand that. Underneath the philosophy, that is who he was. A man writing love letters into a silence, knowing they would not be read, and refusing to stop. And in the pages themselves, he finally did the thing he had never managed in life. He wrote his mother down whole, the work-worn hands, the long quiet at the window, the love that had no words in it. And he found at last all the words for it, every word he could never say to her face across that small kitchen. Because the things you cannot say to a person you can sometimes say about them, on a page, in the dark, years too late and exactly on time. So now, at the very end, we come back to the question that has been walking beside us the whole way, the one we opened with in the dark. Was his yes earned? All of it, the imagining of Sisyphus happy, the loving of a life with no meaning in it, the stubborn insistence that the silence could be born and even blessed. Was it hard-won truth, or was it the most beautiful evasion of the century, the work of a man too in love with the sun to finish the darker thought? I promised you at the start that I would not pretend to settle that, and I am not going to break the promise now, in the last hour, when your guard is down and you would probably let me. The doubts are all still standing. The suspicion that his happy Sisyphus was itself a kind of leap, a consolation smuggled in past his own rules. The charge that his clean hands were a luxury, that his silence when it counted was a failure and not a grace. The man on the beach with no name, whom even this humane imagination could not fully see. They are all real, and I am not going to make them disappear with a soft voice at bedtime, because that would be its own kind of lie, and he hated lies more than he ever hated the dark. But I will tell you the one thing I have come to believe, and then I will let you sleep. Somewhere in the middle of his life, between the wars and the wounds, he wrote a sentence I think is the truest thing he ever said, and it is the answer that is not an answer. In the depth of winter, he wrote, I finally learned that there was in me an invincible summer. That is the whole of it. The yes was never the sunny, easy thing his critics feared, the shallow optimism of a lucky man. It could not have been because of where he found it. He found his summer in the depth of the winter, not instead of it. The warmth was down inside the cold, and it had to pass through everything to reach him. Through the dead father and the silent mother and the blood at 17, through the plague years and the broken friendship and the country tearing itself in half, through every doubt we have raised tonight, all the way to a wet road and a tree. A summer found in that much winter is not an evasion. It may be the hardest one thing a person can carry. Whether it is finally true, whether the yes holds all the way down, I honestly cannot tell you, and neither could he. That one you will have to test for yourself, in your own winters, which will come as everyone's do. But you know now at least exactly what it cost him to say it, and that it was not said cheaply, and that a man reached all the way down into the cold and came back up with a summer in his hands and held it out to you before he went. That is what a night like this one is finally for. Not to decide whether he was right, you can do that in the daylight, or never, but to keep company for a few quiet hours, with a mind that looked at the hardest thing there is and did not look away, and loved the world anyway, out loud to the end. You have kept that company tonight all the way to the last page in the mud, and now you are allowed to set him down. It is very late now, and there is nothing more to carry. Let the questions lie where they have fallen. They will keep. They have kept for 70 years and more, and they will still be there in the morning, patient and unfinished. And you do not have to answer a single one of them tonight. You have carried them far enough for one night. Set them down. Notice how quiet the room is now, that same silence we began with. The silence of the house full of women, the silence of the mother at the window, the silence of the whole enormous universe that will not tell us why. It is here with you, in the dark, and feel how it has changed. It is not a void. It was never a void. It is only quiet, and quiet is a thing you have always known how to rest inside, since long before you had words for anything at all. The silence that frightened the boy and frightened the philosopher and frightens all of us at noon is, right now, in this room, simply peace. Let it be peace. Let your body go. It has held you up all day, and it can stop holding now. There is nothing left to do with it but let it be heavy and warm and breathing, sinking a little further into the bed with every breath that leaves you. You do not have to be lucid anymore. You do not have to be brave or awake or anyone at all. You can let the whole day and the whole long effort of being a person slip off you like a coat and lie here with none of it. I am going to go quiet soon and let you go the rest of the way on your own, down past the last of the thinking, into the place that has no ideas in it. You can take one warm thing down with you, if you like. Take the summer, the invincible one, the one he found in the middle of the winter and could not be talked out of. Carry it down into the dark like a small stone warmed in the sun, and hold it and let everything else go. There is nothing to solve. There is nowhere to be. There is only the dark, which asks nothing of you, and the quiet, which is not empty, and your own slow breath going out and out and out. Rest now. You did well to stay this long. Sleep well.